Chapter 1093. When Harriman and the law narrator sat down to chat, a large pile of firewood had been piled up in an empty field outside the town of Cachalin. Whether it was the dead villagers, the security officers, or the wolf riders who had caused the deaths of the former, they were to be burned to ashes to prevent the plague from spreading. Amidst the crackling of the firewood and the weeping of the bereaved, Harriman learned the man's name for the first time. His name was Toulouse. This was both his surname and his given name. In other words, this law narrator was a descendant of a noble, but he had no one to whom he was loyal to. Before they started chatting, Toulouse was using a stone-pounding stone to grind down the chrysanthemum, yellow and white flowers, as well as some other herbs. Then, he used a small bottle of distilled liquor to clean the wound, before wrapping the herbal paste around the wound with a clean linen cloth. He gave a demonstration to the others who were going to take care of the injured. After those people left, Toulouse began a formal conversation with Harriman. Toulouse went straight to the point. "You're foreigners?" "That's right. We're from the Ramsey continent. You don't look like merchants but more like elite mercenaries. But you're a little too few, not even a small mercenary team." Toulouse was puzzled as he spoke. He really could not guess the background of Harriman's group. Harriman pondered for a moment, deliberating over his words, and then said, "We're adventurers. It's just that I'm now working for someone else to pay off the debt I incurred when crossing the sea by ship. Of course, my fellow adventurers don't need to be burdened by it, because I'm the one who brought us to Tapped Island. It has nothing to do with them." Toulouse immediately grasped the main point in Harriman's words. "You're working for someone else? From the way you talk, you should be a noble from the Ramsey continent. Someone who can make you work for them must be a great noble." At this moment, Toulouse paused and looked at Harriman again with a hint of worry in his eyes. "So many nobles from the Ramsey continent are gathered here. This is definitely not a good thing for Tapp. They have an expeditionary force, more numerous than you can imagine." Harriman looked Toulouse in the eye. At the same time, he also confirmed the other party's suspicions with his words, but he did not reveal the identity of the Soft Maple people. Furthermore, they have already formed an alliance with the Jomi's allied army that has occupied half of Tapt in the north. In less than a month, the two armies will meet near the capital of Wessex. "Why are you telling me this?" Toulouse didn't have a good impression of the Yamshans who had wreaked havoc in the northern lands of Tapp. In fact, most of the Tapps were like this. Only the blacksmiths who were requisitioned and a small number of merchants who were allowed to do business with the army were exceptions. However, he soon understood the deeper meaning of Harriman's words. "Is the large expeditionary force you mentioned nearby, and can take down Cachalin at any time?" Harriman nodded. However, he did not reveal that the Soft Maple army was only a few dozen kilometers away from Cachalin. If they were to march at full speed, it would take at most a day and a half for the infantry to reach the town. Although he could reveal the Soft Maple's strategic plans, they were all here to obtain wealth and occupy land. Anyone who could think on Tapped Island would be able to easily deduce this. He did not mention a single word about their tactical deployment. Messias was escorted to a town called Lashford by the Wolf Riders. The Wolf Riders stirred up a huge commotion in the town before they finally found the chief physician appointed by the prefectural administration. However, the man did not have a good way to treat Magistrate Messias's injuries. He could only use a soldering iron to heal the flesh, apply some anti-inflammatory ointment, and then force the magistrate to drink some strong liquor mixed with skuma to relieve the pain. After that, the Wolf Riders did not care about their exhaustion. They forcibly commandeered some good horses from the stables in Lashford and took Messias on their journey once more. They did not care about the strength of their legs at all. Each Wolf Rider took turns to ride. Finally, they arrived at the prefectural capital, Valensburg, in the evening of the second day. At this time, Messias was delirious from his fever, and had only drunk a small amount of water for the entire day. Fortunately, the prefectural capital was a prefectural capital. Not only did Valensburg have more physicians, alchemists, and apothecaries than all the other towns in the territory combined, there were also a few magi hired by the prefectural governor. The physicians first consulted Messias before performing an emergency operation to treat the blood clots and inflamed and suppurated wounds in his body. During the operation, the alchemists used the precious universal blood tonic to prolong Messias's life. Next, the sorcerers took turns to cast minor healing, and the flesh and blood that had been cleaned up from the inside out grew back. At noon on the second day after Messias lay on his large bed, this great lord of the southern part of Nantapt Island, a great noble, an important vassal of King Vixith, and one of the 6 important prefectural governors of Nantapt Island finally opened his eyes. According to the physician's instructions, he could not drink alcohol for a period of time, so he only dipped his honey bread in wine. However, apart from this small flaw, the goat cheese, cream of mushroom soup, and oatmeal pudding provided by the kitchen were to his liking. After resting for 2 days, green cheese, capers, honey-roasted wild boar meat, black pudding, pickled herring, and other heavier foods appeared on his dining table. This meant that Messias's health had recovered to its previous state. Miraculous magic, superb medical skills. Messias could not help but sigh inwardly. Of course, as a qualified ruler, he would not forget some other people. And loyal warriors. Only the combination of these 3 can ensure the safety of a king. He called for his clerk on the day he recovered. Messias needed to write 2 letters. One was to be sent to King Vixith, informing him of the injustice his loyal vassal had suffered. The other letter was to be sent to the Northumbrian sheriff, Elerwin, who had a territorial dispute with him. He wanted an explanation as to why he had been attacked by people using unknown weapons while hunting in the disputed land. Chapter 1094. Your Majesty the wise and revered King Vixias, Lord of the 6 fiefs of Nantapt, the actual owner of Tensberg and Wickford, and the twin cities, may you have a long reign and be in good health. Your loyal vassal and servant, Messias, sends you my sincere blessings from your bed in Wallingsburg. Hunting in the birch forest near the town of Cachalin has seriously damaged my health and my honor. Myself and my family members wish to obtain a fair and just judge. I hope you can authorize me to temporarily take over the legal judgment and arrest of bandits in the town of Cachalin, so that peace can be restored here. The clerk used the official language of the Nantaput region to recite Zhang Yu's copy of the letter fluently, but the man sitting behind the desk did not look up. The man was bent over a scroll of parchment, his quill flying across the paper, leaving behind long, thin handwriting. The man was old, in his 60s, but his shoulders were still broad and his body strong. His long hair was no longer as red as it used to be. It was now gray, but there were still traces of copper in it. He was wearing a plain white linen jacket with ink stains on the cuff. He only had one accessory on him, which was a golden stamp ring on the ring finger of his right hand. The pattern on the ring was a sturdy horse standing upright. After reading the letter, the clerk bowed and put the copied letter on the desk of the old man in front of him. Then, he left the small study. When he left, he did not forget to turn the lock so that the door would lock from the inside when it hit the door frame. The old man who was working at his desk did not raise his head. The quill in his hand kept jumping on the parchments, but from time to time, he would pick up some fine white sand from the sand jar to absorb the ink. The only sound in the room was the rustling of his writing. Books were piled up against the wall, almost reaching the ceiling. There were also scroll boxes between the piles, some of them old and worn. The only decoration was a large map of the southern kingdom of Nantaput that hung over the fireplace. There were some brief annotations, the handwriting still thin and long. Strangely, some of the annotations were written in red ink, while others were written in black. There was a list of names at the bottom edge of the map, all written in black ink but crossed out in red ink. It was a long list. The name Messias was there, but it had not been completely written, nor had it been crossed out with a pen dipped in red ink. After finishing the last letter that had to be sent out today, the old man finally stood up. He exhaled a mouthful of turbid air, twisted his stiff neck, and stretched himself. He drank a glass of milk on the table and ate a few biscuits with bits of pickled fruit and nut. That was the end of his dinner. Although only the rich would be able to afford those refined biscuits if they were sold in a pastry shop, as a king, Vixitha's dinner was so simple that it made one's heart ache. However, he didn't care. Wasting is not only a shameful act, but also an unforgivable crime. Especially in a place like Tapt, where resources are limited, King Vexith told himself inwardly, something his father had taught him since he was a child. He crossed his fingers, leaned his elbows on the table, and stared at the copied letter from Messias, who had several major vassals under his command. He fell into deep thought and calculation. He was weighing the gains and losses. Should I get the modified human to change direction and take care of this official's health? The Northumbrian soldiers had been on the road for 10 days. The orange and lemon trees were getting thinner and thinner, replaced by a dense forest. The trees were nameless, and the further north they went, the taller they became. The temperature was also rising, and the journey was scorching. It was really torturous to be drenched in sweat every day. They didn't like the forest. It was full of a rotten smell, and countless annoying insects buzzed noisily. It was like a madhouse at night. The only light came from the half-moon above the canopy, painting everything in the forest with a layer of light blue. Leading them was Sheriff Ellerwin, who rode a trained pony at the front of the group. Each group of soldiers was given a small bottle of anti-mosquito ointment, which was kept and distributed by the captain. They couldn't light fires and smoke away mosquitoes when they were resting in camp, so they could only use the ointment bought from the alchemists to fight off the insects. Other than mosquitoes, there were other dangerous creatures hidden in the forest. For example, tigers, poisonous snakes, and wild boars that rummaged around for food. Fortunately, there were more than 200 people in the Northumbrian army, and those animals generally wouldn't provoke so many scary upright apes gathered together. Once, the army encountered a jungle sloth that was foraging for food. The beast was at least 15 or 16 feet tall when it stood up straight, and its body was covered in long fluffy hair. It crawled around on 4 thick but long legs, and its claws were frighteningly sharp. Its head was like a long pipe, and its mouth was only a slit. It let out an unclear howl when it tore off saplings, and the crackling sound of branches breaking echoed in the forest. Fortunately, the army's scouts discovered it in time. The soldiers all held their breaths for a while, and the jungle sloth disappeared. After trekking for a while, they finally saw a large river that bordered the forest, and there was a small town formed by stilted buildings on the shore. The river was nearly a mile wide, but unlike the usual riverside towns, there was no ferry in sight. The town simply spanned across the river, and the foundations of the town's buildings were some stilted platforms made of wood and bricks. There were many houses on top of the platforms, and the building style was the same as the crumbling buildings. Each platform was connected by a rope bridge, and there were some small boats that were constantly traversing the river. There were 2 canals built next to the river in the town, which could be regarded as a moat, and could also be used as a flood channel during the rainy season. When the original builders designed the town, they must have put in a lot of effort, and the whole town was built to be easy to defend and difficult to attack. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been used as an important frontier of the country, and used to connect the various trading towns in the area where the river flowed. Elwine of Northumbria had come to the town under the orders of King Vixias to take over its jurisdiction. According to the information from the coastal areas in the north and east, the Yomians who came to attack Tapt Island had found another powerful ally. One of them was going to come down from the north, while the other was going to come down from the east. The 2 armies would soon form an alliance near this place. If the alliance was successful, the scattered trading towns would become supply points for the enemy army. The grain, steel, coal, leather, and cloth that were supposed to be transported between the north and south of Tapped Island, but were temporarily piled up in the warehouses because of the war, would become an aid for the enemy when they went down south to plunder the country. The mayor of this river-crossing town was a merchant nobleman, so he was used to judging the situation. King Vixias didn't trust the man's integrity and courage, so he ordered Elwine of Northumbria to personally take over this important river pass. He brought 300 of his personal guards into the town and immediately announced the king's order to the public. He then removed the mayor's authority to mobilize the army, and let him return to his home to write a report. Apart from the platform where his family was located, the mayor and his relatives were not allowed to set foot on any other platforms. Otherwise, they would be arrested and tried. In less than half a day, more than a dozen small towns along the river had also submitted their orders of obedience to Elwine. The mayors of each town sent their guards to the Northumbrian commandery's army for deployment and combat training. There weren't too many of these soldiers. At least, compared to the tens of thousands of Yomians and soft maple soldiers mentioned in the information sent by King Vixias, 3,000 was not a deterrent number. Elwine of Northumbria couldn't mobilize more men from his fief, and his soldiers had cities, towns, and villages that needed to be protected. But fortunately, compared to the soldiers who forcefully pulled people from the peasants and stuffed them with sticks or spears to make up the numbers, the guards of the trading towns were semi-professional soldiers. Although they hadn't fought a real battle, they had all received a certain degree of military training and captured vicious bandits. They had also seen blood in order to maintain order in their respective towns. Elwine broke up the original organization and reorganized them according to different standards. He let his personal guards lead and train them, hoping to create a river patrol army before the war. In addition to training the soldiers, Elwine also took on the task of litigating and explaining the law. He had to sort out the connections between the various trading towns along the river as much as possible. It was precisely because of this that the Northumbrian lords understood for the first time why King Vixias had left some undecided autonomous towns that weren't part of the 6 major fiefs. The relationships between them were too chaotic, and only time could dilute the barriers between them and make them easier to govern and manage. But due to the impending war, Elwine didn't have much time left. He could only sleep for 5 hourglasses a day at most, and the rest time was even less than when he led the army through the forest. Fortunately, the trading towns along the river didn't lack tea stocks, and Elwine had to rely on those precious herbal drinks to keep himself awake. So, when he received the letter written by his old rival Messias from his bed, since Messias couldn't read or write, the letter must have been written by his clerk, copied in Chinese and sent to his desk, Elwine almost flipped the table in anger. That ignorant and incompetent old idiot is playing tricks again. Ignoring the fact that the other party was a noble like him, Elwine cursed in front of his subordinates. The 2 fish were swimming in the nearby stream. Unfortunately, they were too close to the shore, so he scooped them up. He removed the innards of the fish, wrapped them in burdock leaves and roasted them over the fire. Smelling the aroma of the fish, Grindel revealed a ferocious expression and wolfed down his portion. "Hunger is always the best seasoning," he commented after he finished eating. Keyes didn't care about the hidden meaning in the dwarf's words. Under the dwarf's surprised gaze, he magically took out a pile of cumin, chili powder, salt, basil, and rosemary leaves and sprinkled them on the fish. Finally, he took out a lemon and squeezed its juice evenly over the fish. "This is a snack," Keyes said matter-of-factly. With his size, even if all the fish in the river were added together, it wouldn't be enough for him to eat until he was full, let alone a single fish. "It's just a taste." The dwarf felt a deep sense of malice. He went out to find a big tree and punched and kicked it to digest his food before returning to sleep. The next morning, Keyes hunted a deer for breakfast. He only ate 1 leg, while Glindo stuffed the rest of the ribs and 3 legs into his stomach. "Eat breakfast like a king," the dwarf said to Keys. Keys agreed with his point of view, so he took out a bottle of milk wine and shared it with Glindo. I'm going to take a look at Wallingsburg. I'm getting bored here, and I need to speed up this adventure. After breakfast, Keys covered the campfire with moist soil, leaving only a few dry branches smoldering in the hole below. Some smoke and dust would be released into a nearby shrub through the flue pipe dug out yesterday, so it wouldn't attract attention. Every few hourglasses, he only needed to add a few sticks of wood from a hole the size of a finger to keep the fire burning, so he didn't have to reignite it the next time. As for what Keys said, Glindo didn't want to think too much about it. After all, he returned to Ramsey this time to be a guide for his companion who had gone on an underground adventure in the Ash world. If it wasn't a mission that required him to go down into a mine, as an underground digger, he wouldn't usually make his own decisions. Come back quickly. Also, leave some ale for me. He knew that Keys had all kinds of drinks in his spatial equipment. Don't drink too much. This is authentic Bergman dwarf beer. I saw Bergman brew it with my own eyes. It's much more precious than the imitation in the cellar of clan leader Grimm's hunting house. Keys agreed to the dwarf's request, leaving behind a small barrel of precious high-quality ale and a sentence that made the dwarf a little confused. He then turned and walked towards Wallingsburg. No way, my tongue never lies to me. Keys did not swagger into the city gate. He disguised the spear in his hand and stuffed it into an ox cart that was transporting fruit. After entering the city, he secretly pulled it out of the cart. After watching the ox cart rumble away, he looked up at the steeple in the distance and walked along the street to the central square of Wallingsburg. Other than King's Landing City, which had no relevant buildings when it was planned, it was easy to find the residence of the ruler of a city, whether it was on the Ramsey continent or Tapped Island. The ground of the square was paved with granite, and flocks of pigeons flew around, gathering and dispersing. The steeple was right behind the square, and next to it was a magnificent 3-story mansion with many windows. It was surrounded by a 10-foot-high stone wall with iron spikes on top. Guards patrolled along the wall in pairs from time to time, and there were 5 people guarding the gate. He counted at least 1 archer on the roof. It was obvious that Magistrate Micius was very concerned about his own safety. Keys walked around the manor a few times, trying to hide in the shadows and avoid being seen. He found 8 more archers on the roof at the back, and 4 guarding the back door. The wall was well maintained, and the nearest cover was more than 20 yards away. The guards were quite alert, changing shifts every 2 hours. There should be a canal underground that could be used to sneak into the manor, but he had reason to believe that the person in charge of Micius's safety would definitely guard such a place to the death. Ordinary people would not be able to get in, Keys finally concluded. He sat on a step next to the square and took an apple that he had just bought from a fruit vendor. "Are you here to petition?" the man asked as soon as he took a bite. "You don't look like a city dweller. Look around with your eyes wide open." Keys knew what he meant. As the law speaker of Wallingsburg, Micius followed the system passed down by his ancestors. On the first day of every month, the legal residents of his territory could come to Wallingsburg to petition. They would get wooden tokens with numbers from 1 to 200 or even more, depending on Micius's mood that day, and line up in the square to wait for Micius to hear their case and make a legally binding judgment. At noon, Micius would also provide lunch for these petitioners. Although it was not a big meal, it was definitely not enough to starve them. "The nobleman from where I came from has a forest fenced off and doesn't allow us hunters to go in and hunt," he said while chewing an apple. "But even if we follow the rules, we still have to pay forest tax to the nobleman once a year." The vendor nodded. He felt that it was better not to get involved in the topic of nobles. Suddenly, his eyes glanced behind Keys, and he immediately put away his chatty expression and knelt on one knee. Keys turned around and saw a group of people entering the square from the north. Wherever they went, the people around them knelt down. Walking at the front was a young man in a long robe. He walked with steady steps and held up a banner with a green vine pattern. Behind him were 5 people walking side by side. They were all dressed in dark green, and each of them had a book in each hand. Walking at the back of the group was an old man in a plain white robe. He looked straight ahead, calm and composed, and had an extraordinary bearing. It was just that his bulging abdomen was a bit of an eyesore. "Kneel down, boy," the fruit vendor scolded softly. "Do you want to be whipped?" At the reminder of the fruit vendor, Keys also knelt on one knee. Of course, this was only what the people around him saw. Just like when the fruit vendor talked to him, he only had eyes for a young man with a shoulder pole. But in fact, he just stood there and ate the apple clean. It was a chanter. Keys thought for 2 seconds before he remembered where he had seen similar clothing and heraldry in a book. Those people belonged to a relatively small druid sect called City Chanters. At this time, the group had already walked a few yards up the stairs. The old man in the white robe lifted the hem of his robe and walked up the stairs. His facial features were nothing special. Apart from his slightly hooked nose, his face was full of wrinkles, and his eyes were dull. It was hard to tell if he was good or evil. Chapter 1096. Messias tried on 4 coats in succession before he finally found a satisfactory dress for the petition day, a set of plain white silk clothes with a crimson tunic over the shoulders, a ruffled collar around his neck, and a gold breastplate inlaid with onyx and gemstones. On his feet, he wore a pair of dark brown calfskin boots made of the finest hickory wood, which produced a clattering sound similar to that of a horse's hooves when he stepped on the ground. Power comes with a price. Messias was well versed in this. When he was young, his father had personally held his hand and explained to him the principle: all power, the power to rule, the power to kill, the power to gather the will of the people, must be obtained with a price. Thus, even though he had just recovered from his injuries and was still feeling tired, he still had to appear in front of the petitioners in Valensburg today. He had the guards open the gates of the house, but only the audience hall outside the inner walls was opened. The inner chambers were the last bastions of the county magistrate, and outsiders were rarely allowed in. The inside of the examination hall was spectacular. The arches and windows were extremely tall, and the sunlight that shone through the stained glass was dyed in various colors. The air was filled with the rich smell of incense. After a long time, everyone was finally in place. The nobles and merchants in fine clothes were in the front row. The poor were in the back, and the poorest could only lean against the wall. A family guard walked along the line with an open gunny sack in his hand. As he walked past, the petitioners in the line reached into the sack and took out a wooden medallion. Before these people were led through the gate, they were all examined one by one, and it was only after they had ascertained that they were not armed that they were allowed to proceed. They passed through a field full of fruit trees and grotesquely trimmed shrubs, and finally entered the audience hall. Each of them received a number plate, in order of 1 to 100, and the rich had no priority. Later, when a number is called, you will step out of the line and follow us to petition. Remember, the number plates are not to be traded or changed. Do not whisper to each other, do not fight, and do not spit on the ground. Otherwise, you will be whipped and, in serious cases, cut. The family guard walked past the petitioners, making sure that his words were heard by all of them. He was followed by 3 soldiers with halberds, and there were even more soldiers hiding behind rows of pillars in the audience hall. Harriman lowered his head and looked at the number tag in his hand. Number 89 could be said to be very far back. Before entering Warlensburg, he had dyed his black hair a reddish-brown with a dye made from insects to hide his black hair, which was very eye-catching on Tapped Island. But the hastily made dye had faded a little last night, and today he must buy a woolen kerchief from the market and wrap his hair in it. The first petitioner was an old man. He had come on behalf of the villagers to complain about the recent increase in rent, blaming their landlord for spoiling his son too much. "Buy him a horse every month, my lord. That won't do. Everyone is starving, but that 12-year-old young master insists on riding the newly bought stallion." "The name of your landlord?" asked Messias. "It is Lord Gavin, my lord. I remember that his eldest son went to a duchy in the north a few years ago to study as a squire for a night, and was killed in a battle with the pirates of Joms." Messias thought for a moment, recalling the name Gavin. The collar around his neck made it difficult for him to lower his head or turn his head. "Yes, my lord. Since then, Lord Gavin has doted on his youngest son more and more," replied the old man. "Your story has been recorded," said Messias to the old man. "We will discuss the decision as soon as possible." And so, one by one, the petitioners told the same sad story: unjust rent, arbitrary disinheritance, land grabs, and a young girl who asked for a sum of money to buy a wooden prosthetic leg for her grandfather, who had been crippled in the service of some ambitious ancestor of the feudal lord. "I think the decision can be passed at once." Messias made a gesture, and a servant came forward and handed the girl a purse containing twice as much money as she had asked for. There was a commotion, and everyone was full of praise. "He is not stupid," Harriman thought to himself. This magistrate Messias clearly knew how to prioritize when dealing with matters. However, such a person would also become very terrifying when they hated someone or something. At noon, the servants carried the table and benches into the hall, and the table was soon covered with bread, chicken, cheese, and steaming bowls of soup. The food was ordinary but rich. The petitioners sat down happily to eat, but the magistrate had already left the hall to dine alone. Harriman noticed that many of the petitioners remained, even though they had already petitioned. It was understandable that the poor would do so, but it was interesting that some of the rich would do so as well. The petitioning continued in the afternoon, and soon after it began, Harriman guessed why the rich had stayed. They wanted to see a spectacle, or rather, how their magistrate would deal with a storm. How Messias dealt with the matter would determine how the rich would treat a group of people who had been in contact with him. An old man in a plain white robe walked to the center of the audience hall and stood precisely on the relief of a fine horse on the floor. His voice was not loud, but everyone in the audience hall could hear him clearly. The position was well chosen, and Harriman saw the distance. As Herod, his knowledge often enabled him to draw parallels. "Reverend Magistrate Messias, on behalf of the congregation, I would like to extend my greetings to you. Yesterday was the day of reconciliation, and the congregation took inventory of the past loans and unfinished construction projects." As he spoke, he extended his hand, and a congregation deacon in a dark green robe immediately ran over and placed a scroll in the elder's hand. The various landlords in the fief owe the congregation the following: Sir Enruger built a mill, but there are still 500 silver cubes of material loan outstanding, and interest will be added on the overdue portion. Baron Winkler built 2 mansions and hired 33 certified craftsmen from the congregation, but there are still a total of 1,627 silver cubes and 15 copper. Lord Gavin built a first-class stable, but there are still 53 silver cubes of material and labor fees owed to the congregation. Last year, Magistrate Messias of Valensburg, that is, you built a drainage canal, a warehouse in the commercial district, a racetrack in the mansion, and a series of important city defense facilities that should not be disclosed to the public, as well as the repairs and maintenance of the spire. Including the discount provided to you and the taxes that the congregation has to pay this year, you still have a total of 36,000 silver cubes of debt outstanding. Interesting, Harriman thought to himself. Someone actually dared to demand payment from Messias on the petition day. His ears perked up as he carefully listened to the whispers of the people around him. Soon, he had a general understanding of the so-called congregation. As it turned out, it was an organization of druids, and the druids in it were the more obscure branch of city druids. Because they were favored by King Vixith, the congregation had a lot of influence in the southern kingdoms. They relied on providing loans to the various feudal lords to build their territories, as well as contracting the construction projects of the various feudal lords to earn money to maintain the congregation's operations. There were also some merchants who had purchased the services of the congregation, but only a small group of the wealthiest merchants had the financial resources to do so. Some people guessed that the congregation was able to gain the support of King Vixith because they could build cities in the king's fief at a very reasonable price. The money used to support the construction of those cities was earned by the Druids from the various feudal lords and wealthy merchants. However, there was no concrete evidence. Through listening to the news, coupled with the knowledge gained from his higher education in King's Landing, Harriman had a clearer view of the congregation's actions than anyone else present. Apart from the congregation's operation model, he also had a rough idea of the congregation's objective. Even though they did not worship a specific god, but since these Druids were of the City Druids branch, they could only promote their teachings by constantly building and perfecting larger cities, allowing the Druids within the congregation to grow stronger. Building a more complete large-scale city was undoubtedly in line with the intentions of King Vixith, who was known for his great talent and bold vision. That was why the congregation and the king came to an agreement. With the combination of the two, the congregation and the kingdom could both become more powerful. To be honest, this was very much in line with the concept of the scale of perpetual order in the Ramsey continent. In other words, King Vixith's choice to cooperate with the Druid conclave was actually the correct choice to lead the country to prosperity. However, Harriman vaguely felt that their model was different from that of the scale of perpetual order. The scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce guided the development of the various city-states in the Ramsey continent. Generally, they would start by investing in the construction of high-standard roads. Then, such roads would naturally attract more pedestrians to walk on them and use them to reach the various cities. First, there would be more traffic, then the cities would develop and expand on their own. On the other hand, the model of the Southern Kingdom, Tapped Island, was the exact opposite. The king relied on the congregation to build attractive cities, then relied on these cities to attract more people. Actually, it was still unknown which of the two models was better. Harriman did not want to admit his superiority, so he felt that the model of Tapped Island was likely to be problematic. However, another person who was also listening to the congregation's petition, Keyes, who was standing in the corner of the audience hall with his arms crossed, felt that this model had its merits. Chapter 1097. In order to ensure the normal operation of the congregation, as well as the smooth progress of the construction projects of the lords, landlords, and wealthy merchants, I believe that within 10 days after the petition day, the sound of gunfire interrupted the elder's words. The chest and back of his white robe were dyed red by the blood that gushed out from his wounds. A few deacons in dark green robes rushed forward. Some of them tried to press on the elder's wounds with their hands, but to no avail. Among the petitioners, a man in a dirty, patched shirt ran desperately toward the door. He held a short, thick, double-barreled musket in his hand. As he ran, he fired at the guards of the Messias family who tried to pounce on him. "Catch him!" a deacon of the congregation yelled. He had just stood up beside the elder who had lost his life, and there was still a pool of blood on his hand. But as he clasped his hands together, a relief sculpture of a knight on the wall in front of the audience hall leaped out of the wall. The thin knight raised his spear and charged at the assassin. The man used the last shot in his double-barreled musket to disperse the knight in front of him. But as soon as he stepped out of the audience hall, a crossbow bolt pierced his throat. Messias stood up from his seat and tore off the stiff collar around his neck. In his other hand, he pulled out a crossbow from under his seat. Sheriff Messias led his men to the assassin's side. With the tip of his shoe, the man fell to the ground with his face facing the sky. "Tell me, who sent you?" Sheriff Messias stepped on the man's chest and roared at him with spittle flying out of his mouth. Unfortunately, the crossbow bolt had already torn the man's vocal cords, and he could only let out a meaningless whimper. His face was turning purple, and it was obvious that he was about to suffocate to death. Messias frowned, perhaps because his shoe had touched something. He bent down and took out a piece of parchment from the man's chest. Although he was illiterate, there were still people in the audience hall who could read. Messias handed the parchment to a deacon of the congregation who hurried over. "Read it to me," Messias said to the deacon. But the deacon stopped after a few sentences and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. "It's okay, there's nothing to hide from the petitioners." Messias waved his hand. "Read it out loud, and let everyone know who this man is." Well, the deacon had to obey. "The current Joms Ranger, Carl, is hired by all the villagers of Catchalin Bazaar to eradicate the greedy elder of the congregation. Due to the latter's advice to Magistrate Messias, the residents of Catchalin town are unable to afford the corresponding taxes due to the construction of buildings everywhere in the fief. This agreement is made in duplicate. After the bounty is completed, Carl himself can take this agreement to Catchalin and ask for the balance of the bounty, which is a total of 100 silver coins. The deacon's words immediately sparked a heated discussion among the petitioners. Most of the petitioners of the Catchalin Bazaar of Catchalin Bazaar. People were constantly exchanging their opinions in low voices, and the entire audience hall was filled with buzzing sounds like bees flapping their wings. "Silence!" Messias roared. "Where's the clerk?" Before his voice trailed off, a man ran out from the back of the audience hall with a quill in his hand. He seemed to have forgotten to put it on the table in a hurry. "My lord," the man panted, "write me a long list of words." Messias spread his hands in front of him, about a yard apart. "Tell my vassals, allies, and supporters who paid a despicable bounty, colluded with the Joms bastards who invaded Tapt, and plotted the murder of the elder of the congregation in front of me on such a holy day." Every strand of Messias's beard seemed to stand up as he spoke, and he looked terrible when he was angry. In an instant the entire audience hall fell silent. No one even dared to breathe loudly. The ruler of Valensburg scanned the crowd with his eyes, as if looking for dissidents. "I will punish the outlaws of Catchalin Bazaar in the name of law and justice." He nodded with satisfaction. This was the right atmosphere. Messias reached out and pulled out the scepter tied to his belt. It was his 6-page hammer called the Morning Star. He gripped the handle of the scepter with his hand. "Of course," he said loudly, "I will also be merciful. Let's start with this poor fellow." He pointed the scepter at the assassin who had a crossbow bolt in his throat, then bent down and smashed the man's head with the hammer, ending the man's suffering. The day of petition ended abruptly. Because of the sudden assassination, many petitioners' demands were not resolved. One of them was the Druid conclave, which had lost an elder. Harriman followed the crowd out of the audience hall and immediately returned to the inn to find old Weather. He had already understood Messias's idea. It was time to go back to Catchalin and recruit allies for the Soft Maple Expeditionary Force. Their lord was a very narrow-minded and insidious person. The townspeople had no other choice. Valensburg issued an order for the army to gather. The army could depart tomorrow and reach Catchalin the day after tomorrow to exact their righteous revenge. In other words, Harriman could find the gunslingers and dwarves waiting outside the city within a day, then rush to the town at full speed. Then he could persuade the law clerk and the villagers under his rule with a few words, then use a communication scroll to contact Grisus and have him send people to Catchalin to help with the defense of the town. If all went well, the Soft Maple Expeditionary Force would be able to exchange blows with the Lord and Sheriff of Catchalin Bazaar in 2 days. At that time, with their advantage in numbers and weapons, Messias would not be able to escape as easily as he did in the Battle of Birch Forest. And if King Vixais lost such a high-ranking official, the Soft Maple Expeditionary Force would quickly conquer and occupy his territory. The only problem was that if they took over Messias's territory too easily, the Soft Maple Expeditionary Force would be able to reap the fruits of their victory. several cities including Valensburg, villages rich in agricultural products, and the wealth stored in the mansions of the nobles. But their desire to plunder when they first crossed the sea would not be able to be vented on the people of the territory. This was a very tricky problem for an army, especially one that played the role of an invader. It was related to the morale of the army. But that was a problem for the mayor and the Lord's Council to worry about. Harriman did not want to solve it for them. Chapter 1098. Oh, of course. Times have changed. Old Weasel thought for a moment and said, "Nowadays, apart from a small number of bandits who practice bows and crossbows, most of them use inferior firearms to make up for the numbers. They don't like to use weapons like swords anymore." Harriman nodded. That was indeed the case. However, bandits who preferred firearms over swords didn't live long in the Ramsey continent either. That was because the patrols in the various cities were also issued firearms of better quality and longer range. Those bandits either died in a purge or were killed by their own firearms. However, Harriman couldn't help but think of the Japanese bandit group that had recently appeared in the Green family's territory. He wondered how they had been purged. Did the lightning monk in that group cause any trouble? Next, the guard at the city gate continued to shout for the people in the queue to walk to the city gate. Regardless of whether one entered or exited the city, one had to pay a gate fee of 2 copper coins. However, because there was a curfew in Wallingsburg, compared to the cost of a night's stay in the city, it was undoubtedly more cost-effective to leave the city on the same day. Therefore, most of the farmers who entered the city to sell things would leave the city and return to their villages on the same day. The coins they paid would be used to pay the soldiers, repair the roads in Wallingsburg, reinforce the city walls, and many other things. However, the muddy road full of the smell of excrement under his feet made Harriman feel that the money was either not enough or had been used for other purposes. There was a sudden commotion at the city gate, but it was quickly suppressed. A few farmers pushing small carts retreated from the gate and made way for 2 people entering the city in the evening. A man and a woman rode into the city on horses. The woman was short and stout, with a large rat on her shoulder. She had a beautiful head of honey-colored blonde hair, but her eyes were cold, as if she was constantly scheming something. The man had a strong build, and his narrow hooked nose was particularly eye-catching, reminding people of vultures and scavengers. Both of them wore thick dirty clothes, and their bodies were bulging from head to toe. They looked like horsemen who traveled through the night. However, what really caused the farmers to riot was their mount. They were much larger than the average tapped horse. Harriman estimated that they were about 15 palms tall from their shoulders to the ground. Their bodies were pitch black, with only a tuft of white hair on their forehead. The eyes of these 2 beasts were garnet red, and when they opened and closed their nostrils, a white mist would spurt out. The teeth in their mouths were not like those of ordinary horses, but sharp teeth like those of wild beasts. Harriman also noticed that the legs, chest, and waists of these 2 horses were covered in metal plates. Harriman, who was knowledgeable enough to match his title of Herad, could tell at a glance that there were definitely mechanical structures operating behind those metal plates. Otherwise, installing metal plates in those places would not only be meaningless, but would also increase the weight of the horses for no reason. The hooves of 2 tall horses stepped on the tiles near the city gate. In order to prevent the city from sinking, the city walls of Valensburg had a solid foundation, and the ground near the city gate was paved with tiles. However, the roads in Valensburg were obviously not of such high standard. The sound of the horses' hooves clanging against the stone tiles could be heard. Not only were the farmers frightened, but even the guards at the city gate who had been notified in advance were also shocked when they saw these creatures. However, because the guards knew some inside information, they were even more afraid of the 2 people riding on the horses. Ilavera, Harriman interpreted the words from the mouths of the guards as they whispered to each other. In Tapp's language, which was mixed with Pygmy language, the meaning of this accompanying word was more complicated. Enhancer or mutant, depending on the stress. Harriman immediately bowed his head. Because he was going to ride out of the city, he did not wear the woolen headscarf he bought. The ornament that covered his faded hair made him look more like a farmer than a rider with a good horse. Originally, the evening sky would have helped him. After the guards received the copper coins, they would not have noticed whether his hair was reddish-brown or black. However, the two Alavra were different. According to Grice's information scroll, these modified people had keen eyesight. Even in the dark, they could find the best forest scouts of the soft maple people. At this moment, Harriman was a little envious of old Weather. The old servant of the Green family had grayish-white hair because of his age. In addition, he could speak Tapp's language fluently, so he was no different from an old Tapped person. Number 27 and number 34 rode slowly on their horses. 2 days ago, they had just received an order from King Vixith. So, they returned from the swampy tidal flats east of Tapt and rushed all the way to Valensburg. Originally, their mission was to patrol the coast that was not suitable for landing, to ensure that the expeditionary force of the soft maple people did not unexpectedly choose to land there. They also had some companions who were trying their best to eliminate the spies sent by the soft maple people to the southern kingdom of Tap. They wanted to prevent their own intelligence from leaking before the war. The reason why this special force of the kingdom was so scattered, at most, 1 or 2 people would travel together, was because each of them was very strong and capable of completing the mission alone, especially those related to killing. Secondly, the kingdom was in troubled times and could not afford to spare more manpower. Otherwise, each member of this special force had received the corresponding training. They were fully capable of training and leading an army of about 100 people into the war quickly. They were the strongest army under King Vixitha's command. The training they had received since they were young ensured that there was no doubt about it. Each of them was an unparalleled blade, born from the tempering of the furnace. This was the literal meaning, and not some embellishment. King Vixith searched the entire southern kingdom for these people. Some were from orphanages, some were from peasant families, and some were from wealthy merchants or noble families. However, after being selected, they had nothing to do with their past. They no longer had a name, only a code name. Only when they died in battle, which was actually very difficult, or when they had served the king for 25 years and completed their service, only half of the first batch had served, could they regain their name. Then, they would leave the army with their salary over the years, gifts from the king, and honor enough to glorify their entire family. They would spend the rest of their lives in any form they wished. This was King Vixitha's promise. It was carved in the form of words on a stone pillar, and that pillar stood in the middle of the king's audience hall. Every one of the king's vassals had seen the pillar, and they were all witnesses to the promise. And in order to live up to the king's promise, candidates like number 27 and number 34 had already paid a considerable price. They were taught how to read and write from a young age, how to survive in the wild, how to lead an army, how to use strategies, and how to fight. When they grew older, these people would be hung by ropes and lowered into a place called the pit prison. In the lotus-like pits, they had to fight with murderous criminals and hungry beasts every day, using weapons and even their bare hands to fight to the death. Although there were teachers with bows and arrows standing above the pit to watch over them during the fight, and if they were injured, they could also receive treatment from doctors and spellcasters. However, there were still some candidates who ended up with physical disabilities or simply died. After a few years of elimination training, the candidates who survived were close to adulthood. Their physical indicators, height, weight, etc., were also stable. At this time, they would go through an even more cruel test. They needed to receive forging. They would take a large amount of alchemy medicine every day to deal with what happened to them. For a whole year, a few mysterious spellcasters would modify the bodies of these young people. Their flesh, bones, and internal organs would be strengthened to support the various mechanical parts transplanted into their bodies. According to the different physical conditions of each person, the modifications they received would also be different. For example, some people's skin would be completely replaced by a type of magical metal, becoming invulnerable. Some people might have one or even several mechanical arms. Number 27 and number 34, the reason why their clothes were bulging was to cover up their modified bodies. It was not because of shame, but because they all knew that before fighting with the enemy, it was best not to let the enemy figure out their actual situation. After the modifications were completed, this group of young people would officially start their service. They used their own strengths to serve King Vixith. Most of the time, they were tasked with exterminating bandit groups that roamed the borders of the country. This way, not only could they ensure the stability of the country, it could also provide these modified warriors with a chance to fight on the battlefield. Unlike many knights who swore an oath of honor, this Oliveira unit did not care about honor when carrying out their missions. Assassination, poisoning, sowing discord, they would do anything. Their honor could only be reclaimed after they retired. Before that, the king's orders were the first reason for their actions. That was why number 27 and number 34 weren't impatient when they were suddenly called back from patrolling the eastern tidal flats to Valensburg. At most, they were intensely dissatisfied with the main culprit who had caused their previous mission to be interrupted, the ambitious magistrate Macius. The actions of this feudal noble affected King Vixitha's overall arrangement. The two of them came to Valensburg to try their best to maintain the stability of the place, but they also had an optional mission. Whether it was to be carried out or not depended on the judgment of these two on Macius. Chapter 1099. Brother, Black Nose thinks someone is spying on us. Number 27, who had long blonde hair, used the opportunity of combing her hair to speak to her partner using ventriloquism. Number 34 didn't respond to her. He just looked at the crowd around him. His neck was able to move much faster than normal people. Number 34 didn't have any doubts about what number 27 said. The cyborg partners trusted each other's abilities. The black rat on number 27's shoulder was actually a mechanical animal wearing a bionic coat. Its main abilities were reconnaissance and anti-reconnaissance. 38 degrees southwest, the spies are there. Number 27 interpreted the information Black Nose sent to her and immediately reminded her. This time, she said it out loud because Black Nose reported that the spies were doing something else besides spying. That guy took out a weapon. He hid a military crossbow and wants to attack us. Before she finished speaking, a crossbow bolt was shot towards number 34. The hook-nosed man's feet were already out of the stirrup. He swooped forward like an eagle. He wrapped his arms around the neck of the giant black horse under him. After circling it once, he sat back on the saddle. The crossbow bolt had already deviated from its original target. Bang! The crossbow bolt lost its target and stabbed into a small cart of a farmer leaving the city. There were still a few turnips in the cart that hadn't been sold yet. The crossbow bolt pierced into the cart and burst open, bursting into a blazing fireball. The small cart was instantly blown to pieces. The farmer pushing the cart was also killed by the flames and splashing wooden thorns. The city gate was immediately plunged into chaos. The farmers who were still in line before all fled in all directions, desperately trying to get away from this troublesome place. Some of them turned around and ran into the city, while others fearfully bypassed the 2 men and 2 horses next to the gate. They wanted to take advantage of the chaos to get out of Valensburg. The guards tried their best to maintain order, but because they didn't have enough manpower, they couldn't do it. They used spears and the ridges of their swords to hit the running farmers. However, the farmers who saw the scene of death were like a herd of frightened horses. This deterrent force was obviously not enough to calm them down. At this moment, the 2 Alaveras pulled the reins of their horses at the same time. The 2 huge black horses stood up and neighed. Their front hooves, which were nailed with thick iron claws, landed heavily on the brick ground near the city gate, causing brick fragments to fly everywhere. The roar of this kind of giant horse seemed to have some kind of magical power. The people who heard it all involuntarily covered their ears. Some of the more timid people were so scared that they directly squatted on the ground. At the same time, No. 27 also took down a short gun that was as thick as an adult's arm from her saddle hook. She held it with one hand and pulled the trigger in one direction. Pah! A faint green smoke rose from the barrel of the gun, and a grappling claw with a rope attached to its tail shot out from the muzzle. In the blink of an eye, the grappling claw shot out dozens of meters away. The flying claw caught the shoulder of a person who had lowered his body and was trying to escape under the cover of the crowd. That person was wearing a patched brown tunic with breeches and a pair of leather sandals. He was also wearing a fur-lined jacket. The military crossbow he used to ambush number 34 was hidden in it. When the assassination failed, the person immediately took off his fur-lined jacket and wrapped it around the crossbow before throwing it to the ground. That fur-lined jacket was worth some money. If someone who saw the money picked it up, it might be able to block a disaster for him. It was a good plan. Unfortunately, he met two Alaveras who had eagle-like eyesight. The reason number 27 and number 34 were sent by King Vixith to patrol the eastern coast was because their eyes had been modified. The spellcasters had changed their eyes, adding more neural tissue and some sophisticated mechanical parts. Whether it was day or night, if there were no obstacles blocking their vision, they could easily see every blade of grass and tree tens of kilometers away. Moreover, within 100 meters, if they focused their eyes on someone, even a fly wouldn't be able to escape their gaze. The grappling claw dug deep into the assassin's flesh like a powerful hand gripping the shoulder blade of the assassin. Number 27, who was riding on the back of the black horse, put the musket back on the hook. She pulled the rope shot out from the muzzle and wrapped it around a protruding wheel on the horse's back. Then, she patted the horse's neck with a specific rhythm. The wheel began to spin, wrapping the rope back into a disc. At the same time, it pulled the wailing assassin to the side of the black horse. "Soft maple man," said number 34, leaping from his horse and tearing off the man's woolen kerchief, revealing a head of curly sallow hair. That was the color of most soft maple hair. Coupled with the wide chin, number 34 immediately made a judgment. Of course, that was only part of the answer he came up with. Every Olivera was trained to be familiar with all kinds of calculations from a young age. You are a soft maple. The weapon you use is filled with explosive potions produced by Ramsay. You hid in Valensburg to attack King Vixith's soldiers. However, you are not necessarily obeying the decision of the soft maple mayor and the Lord's Council. After all, you soft maple people are all greedy idiots who only care about money. Number 34 picked the man up from the ground and whispered into his ear. The man tried his best to move his feet downwards, but he couldn't touch the ground. The assassin struggled to no avail. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and spat a thick phlegm at number 34. But even though it was only a short distance away, number 34 nimbly tilted his head and dodged the ambush. He clenched his other hand into a fist and punched the side of the assassin's waist, breaking several of the man's ribs. If you are not hopelessly stupid, you should know. Number 34 suddenly spoke in the language of the soft maple people. Even if a team of wolf knights under Macius came and took you away in the name of interrogation, they would not let you go in the end. Instead, they would shut you up forever. As if to prove his words, at that moment, a group of cavalry suddenly rushed out from the corner of the street opposite the city gate. The hooves of the horses splashed mud everywhere. Even if the passers-by dodged in time, they would most likely be splashed with some of the stinky mud. The people on horseback were all wearing light armor with a wolf's head painted on it. As expected, the assassin's expression changed drastically. Number 34 raised his eyelids and glanced at number 27. The female Olivera nodded almost imperceptibly. The black nose on her shoulder had the ability to detect lies. The mechanical pet could collect the breath, usually the smell of sweat, of the people around it. By detecting the presence of a certain substance, it could determine whether the person's emotions or words were true. People who lied generally could not fool the pet, unless they had the help of a very skilled spellcaster or used some kind of alchemy potion to cover their body smell. "Don't hand me over to them," the assassin said in the language of Tap. As a soft maple person, he could actually speak fluent and authentic Tap. Obviously, if this person was not a spy specially trained by the soft maple people to spy for information, then he was a merchant who had come to Tapt a long time ago to do business with the people of Tap. "I am the secret procurer of Wallingsburg," said the man, speaking quickly, endeavoring to show his worth. "First I was a smuggler, and then Messias employed me to procure flintlocks, cannons, and all sorts of alchemical materials from Ramsey, which are not found in Tapt Island. He paid with soybean oil, purple cedar wood, and gold. Today, he forced me to attack you. He gave me a pound of gold, and said that he wanted to see the effect of the explosive potion." Number 34 narrowed his eyes. The Alaveras were educated and knew the laws of their country very well. He knew that in addition to soybean oil, purple cedar wood and gold were goods controlled by the laws of their country. Only King Vixith had the right to decide whether to use them to trade with the merchants of the Ramsey continent. There was no doubt that Sheriff Macius had violated the laws of the country and harmed the interests of the king. Damn it! The two Alaveras made a decision at the same time. The priority of this secret mission to Wallingsburg had to be increased. No wonder he's so crazy. Keyes looked at the ceremony in front of him, and could not help but feel annoyed. At this time, he was squatting on an open window in the steeple of the sheriff's mansion. However, neither the people outside nor inside the window noticed him, an uninvited guest. Macius had returned to the interior of his steeple after the end of the day of petitions. The steeple was about 150 feet tall, and there was a spiral staircase leading to the top. However, Macius did not take the stairs. Instead, he took a large basket made of pulleys and went from the bottom to a room in the center of the steeple. No one came up with him. In fact, he was the only one who could enter this room. Even the servants who cleaned the place were not allowed to enter. Those who disobeyed would be executed. After entering the room, Messias used a flint to light a lamp in a niche. The flames spread along the hidden holes in the wall, igniting all the niches around the wall. Every niche was inlaid with a silver mirror. The light of the flames was reflected by the silver mirror and gathered in the center of the room. The rays of light intertwined and formed the outline of a huge palm with 6 fingers. "Great Monarch of Darkness," Macius softly chanted a prayer. He then took out a piece of silk soaked in the blood of a virgin and cut it in two with a dagger. He then held the two halves with both hands and extended them into the picture formed by the rays of light. Chapter 1100. Keyes found it hard to imagine that there were people in Ramsey who believed in demons. It was true that the scale of perpetual order had a strong control over the Ramsey continent, but there were believers of the Sovereign of Darkness on Tapt Island. This showed how powerful the demons were. They were like weeds in the fields. Even if a wildfire could not burn them down, they would grow again when the spring breeze blew. There's nothing we can do about it. After all, even the 7 Hills Heaven has seen traces of demons before. Keyes comforted himself. Compared to the situation in the Ash World, it's not hard to accept the appearance of a few demon believers in Ramsey. Anyway, the scale of perpetual order did not deliberately prohibit the spread of the knowledge that the Emperor had mastered. However, no matter how he comforted himself, Keyes was still a little unhappy when he saw the familiar emblem. "You're just like a dogskin plaster. No matter where you are, you dare to stick out your deformed 6 fingers." He cursed in his heart. Graz ZT deserved it. The short summoning ritual was over, and Messias crawled up from the ground. The sheriff of the southern country of Tapt stared eagerly at the shining demon emblem in front of him. "Great monarch of the gloom," he said sincerely, using the broken language of the abyss. It was difficult for the human tongue to imitate the scratching of the words of the creatures of the abyss. "Your servant pays his respects to you." The light in the room remained the same, but the six-fingered palm formed by the reflection of the light in the niche moved. The powerful demon of Asgrath, far away in the abyss, responded to the summoning of the believer. Messias immediately asked the demon to cast a distant vision spell on him, and the six-fingered palm agreed. Graz Zt's evil emblem, formed by the converging light, immediately turned into a smooth round mirror. At the gate of Wallingsburg, the commotion caused by the two Alaveras when they entered the city was all seen by Messias. Similarly, the demon lord and Keys, who was watching the show with his arms crossed, knew what was happening. In this regard, Graz Zt did not say a word. The powerful demon lord was still busy with other things. He had 3 times the territory of other demon lords, so naturally, he was 3 times busier than his competitors. Therefore, it was very likely that the one who responded to Messias was just a consciousness that Graz Zt had left in his silver spire to answer the prayers of the believers. The demon's distant vision spell was very detailed. Not only did Messias see his secret procurement officer, but he also heard what he said after he was captured to save his life. "Soft maple merchants without any honor to speak of," Messias cursed, showing the panic in his heart. Although he knew that the Alaveras' king was, he did not expect the transformed humans to be so difficult to deal with. "Great monarch of gloom," Messias prostrated himself reverently. He already knew the intentions of King Vixethius, and could only give the order to assassinate the 2 androids. However, the 2 transformed humans were unharmed after being shot by crossbow bolts at close range. What was more frightening was that they even captured the assassin. Just like what he did, he never overestimated the loyalty of others, especially when that person was a soft person. "I beg for your help. The enemy has entered my fortress, and I fear that my subordinates are powerless to stop them." Powerless to stop them, or do they not have enough reason? Graz Zt's voice came from the empty light. Although the light was gathered by the bright lights, it gave off a gloomy feeling. "Of course. I, the great demon lord, the sovereign of darkness, have been known for my generosity for countless centuries. I generally do not refuse the requests of my loyal servant." Messias lowered his head and took out a piece of parchment from his chest. It was densely filled with names. "I am willing to pledge my loyalty to you. These are the names of some of my allies within the borders of my kingdom. They all meet the requirements of your instructions. I believe that if you can use them, you will be able to establish your church within the borders of your kingdom much faster." As if drawn by the light, the parchment floated up from Messias' hands and was quickly caught by the invisible hand within the light. The moment the parchment disappeared, a black dot appeared in the center of the light and quickly expanded. Messias looked up and mustered his courage, preparing to witness the descent of a terrifying demon. However, what puzzled him was that the black hole that had opened up to the size of a person's bladder quickly closed, as if it had never appeared. Not only that, the light that had gathered together disappeared into thin air. All that was left in the middle of the room was a cloud of hazy smoke and a stain on the ground that had been scorched by the light. "Great Sovereign of Darkness," Messias tried to ask. "His Majesty Graz Zt has returned to his chambers." The voice came from behind Messias. The sheriff, who was lying on the ground, suddenly rolled to the side and arched his body toward the source of the voice. That was a dark corner of the room. No one could and should be hiding there. "My name is Arthas." The voice suddenly sounded again, but this time, it was not in the language of the abyss but in the common language of the southern region of Tap. Messias looked up abruptly. The person who spoke was standing behind him again, so he could not see the person's face clearly. Instead, Keys, who was squatting on the windowsill, watched everything that happened in the room with great interest. After the black hole appeared in the light curtain that summoned Graz ZT, a man walked out of the black hole. He walked with strange steps, always keeping himself in Messias' blind spot. When he said the first sentence, he had already placed his palm on the sheriff's head, even when the latter was rolling on the ground. And it was obvious that when the man introduced himself, he had already obtained everything he wanted to know from Messias' brain. Not only was he fluent in the common language of the southern region of Tapt, Keyes guessed that there were other things as well. The man was wearing a pure black robe. His black hair was combed into a ponytail. His temples were slightly white, and his forehead was smooth. His cheeks were thin, and his face was expressionless. But judging from his ebony skin and thin body, this man was most likely of dark elf blood. And that was the truth. As the son of Graz ZT and a beautiful dark elf priestess, Arthas, who had black skin and 6 fingers, looked like his father when he was younger. In terms of cruelty and hypocrisy, he was almost the same as Graz ZT. But due to the defect of being a mixed blood, this half-abyssal dark elf did not have his father's magnificent temperament or foresight. Of course, it also depended on who he was compared to. One of Graz ZT's competitors, the demon lord Edimachus, who once ruled the cranioccipital region, 507th layer of the bottomless abyss, had suffered greatly. In Graz ZT's recent attempt to overthrow Edimachus' rule, Arthas played a key role. Using potions and his own charm, he successfully lured Edimachus into the Well of Darkness, a terrifying prison in the bottomless abyss. Due to the attitude of Ma Yuan, the permanent prisoner and warden of the Well of Darkness, who had the title of God Slayer, towards the prisoners, Edimachus, who had lost most of his followers, would not be able to leave the Well of Darkness for the rest of his life. After that victory, Graz ZT gave Arthas the command of most of his demon army. A few secretly mocked the monarch of darkness for not noticing his son's political ambitions. Arthas foolishly thought that this was a sign of Graz ZT's fear of him, and he began to secretly plot against his father. However, this made the black-hearted Graz ZT immensely proud. A son who did not live up to his father's name was most likely a traitor. Moreover, by giving Arthas so much honor, the monarch of darkness had more reasons to order him to do more things. For example, he had Arthas come to a material plane alone to help a noble follower who served him. On the surface, they had come to Ramsey, a material plane with a poor reputation. Moreover, they had come to Tapt Island, which was considered a remote area in Ramsey. Rather than saying that they were here to carry out a mission, it would be better to say that they were here for a vacation and relaxation. However, Arthas did not know that this plane was actually a vassal of a powerful megalosaurus that had recently risen to fame in the multiverse. 4 keys to kill the powerful son of the demon lord. It was not much more difficult than squashing a flea. Even though he had been careful enough to read the information in Messias's brain as soon as he arrived, how could the black-hearted Graz ZT not predict his son's actions? The cunning Six-Fingered had already set up many traps and misconceptions in the head of the sheriff. Therefore, the information that Arthas read was seriously inaccurate, and he had no idea how dangerous his trip was. Just like the feat that he was most proud of, which was to send a demon lord to the side of the previous Godslayer, Graz ZT did not spend much effort to send his overly ambitious son right under the nose of the new Godslayer of the multiverse. Of course, out of respect for his six-fingered father, Arthas still maintained an appropriate level of vigilance. "You can't see me. I am invisible in your eyes." The man relied on his extraordinary footwork to deceive Messias without batting an eyelid. "All you need to know is that I will take care of the 2 Alavras. To me, this is an order from the great monarch of darkness. To you, this is a favor. Those who know how to be grateful usually know how to cherish opportunities. Do you understand what I mean?" It was not easy for the son of the demon lord to come to a material plane, and naturally, He would not forget the traditional art of publicly asking for bribes. Chapter 1101. In the end, Macius used the 30 pounds of gold he had prepared to appease the city's Druid Guild in exchange for Arthas's order to act as soon as possible. The Demon Lord's son promised that he would use a method that would not arouse suspicion to help the sheriff get rid of the two modified humans. Keyes, who was watching the whole transaction with his arms crossed, saw the whole process. A demon that can be bribed with money. Keyes wanted to laugh. How miserable is Prince Arthas in the Abyss? What he did not know was that Arthas was the son of Graz, Zt, and was authorized to command most of the army by Six-Fingered, so Arthas had to be on guard against assassinations at all times in the Abyss. As long as he was in the Abyss, he had to spend a sky-high price to hire a team of 36 armed snake demons to protect him. The salary given by Six-Fingered was far from enough. After reaching a deal with Macius, Arthas instantly jumped out of the window. Keyes stuck to the outer wall of the steeple in time, so he was not touched by the Demon Lord's son who was rushing to earn some extra money. Arthas had inherited the extraordinary agility from his mother and the super endurance of the demon Tana Re. He lightly tapped on the roofs of several houses in Wallingsburg and arrived near the open city gate. At this moment, the wolf riders that Messias had arranged to wait here had just turned the corner of the street. More than 40 riders and their warhorses roared through the street, attracting almost everyone's attention. This made Arthas's super stealth skills seem redundant. He walked lightly into a circus that was preparing to participate in the autumn harvest celebration in the city. He wandered around the encampment as if he was taking a stroll and soon found what he needed. In a circus like this, in addition to the freak show, the knife-throwing performance, and the unskilled spellcasters who knew how to perform magic tricks, there were usually specialized beast-tamers in the circus. After entering Valensburg, the circus troupe would set up camp at the edge of the city for fear that the wild beasts would escape and attack the citizens. This place was not far from the barracks of the garrison troops. While being able to obtain additional guards, it was also convenient for some of the street ladies in the circus troupe to do some business with the soldiers who sneaked out of the barracks to have fun. Arthas happened to bump into a man and a woman who were working at the edge of a wall in a hurry. He walked behind the disheveled soldier and patted him on the shoulder. Immediately after, this person was stunned for a moment. His body also stopped moving, and he even shuddered all of a sudden. Just when the lady thought that the transaction was over, the soldier suddenly extended his hand and pulled out a short dagger hanging on his belt. He forcefully stuffed it into the lady's hand. "Ah!" the woman screamed. The corners of the soldier's mouth curled up, revealing a smile that was uglier than crying. Then, he forcefully grabbed the woman's wrist and stabbed the dagger into his heart. Hot blood spurted out and splashed onto the woman's face. She screamed as she hurriedly pushed the corpse that was still in contact with her to the ground. She did not care that her dress was still tied around her waist. The woman dragged her shoes and ran out of the circus station as fast as she could. "Not bad, we have a motive for the crime." She wanted to escape, so she opened the animal pen and released the beast inside. Arthas, who had personally directed all of this, tiptoed and lightly leaped over the corpse lying on the ground. With one step, he jumped to the side of the animal pen more than 10 yards away. The half-demon dark elf tilted his head and thought for a second or two. Then, he hooked his finger and opened the gate of the animal pen where a stag was locked. This was a large antler deer that the circus usually used to pull carriages. Because it had been castrated, it had a docile temperament. Arthas used his extraordinary charm to charm it to walk out of the animal pen. Then, he stroked its neck and said a series of evil words that mortals could not understand in an extremely gentle tone. The stag abruptly stood on the spot and raised its head high. The gonads on its lower body that had been cut off suddenly bulged, causing its skin and flesh to appear somewhat transparent. One could see the blood vessels on it with the naked eye. However, the blood flowing in those blood vessels was not red blood, but some kind of strange dark green liquid. As the bulge continued to pump and shrink, the liquid was quickly absorbed by the male antler deer's body. "Let's go, my brave warrior." Arthas smiled with satisfaction, tapped his lower lip, and wiped the tip of the stag's nose with his finger. This natural creature that had been corrupted by the demons immediately let out an angry roar. It lowered its head and rushed to the fence near the circus's station. Accompanied by the cracking sound of the wooden board, the stag that had transformed into a ferocious beast rushed into the streets of Wallingsburg. "Brother!" Sitting on the back of the horse, number 27 suddenly looked up into the distance. Black Nose had just reminded her with a low squeak that it had sensed an evil magic wave nearby. It was the first time that number 27 had heard a mechanical familiar describe something like that. A magic wave was a magic wave, so why would it be labeled with the word evil? Although she was confused, she still reminded her partner in time. Number 34 immediately knocked out the captured soft maple assassin. He took the rope gun from number 27's saddle hook and tied the captive into a dumpling with a piece of rope. Then, he threw the captive on the back of No. 27's saddle and let the giant black horse carry the captive instead of handing him over to the guards of Wallingsburg near the city gate. "I'll go check out the situation. You guard the city gate first." After saying this concise and comprehensive sentence, number 34 flew into the distance, leaving his black giant horse to number 27 to look after. As partners, they were very familiar with each other, so there was no need to explain too much. Just like number 27's modification focused on reconnaissance and anti-reconnaissance, number 34's ability was more suited for launching surprise attacks and breaking out of encirclement. Even if Magistrate Macius really didn't care, as long as number 27 could guard the city gate for a moment, number 34 was confident that he could break out of the encirclement with 2 men and 2 horses. In the worst-case scenario, he would just have to abandon the 2 giant black horses. He could still break out of the encirclement with his partner. However, the cost of breeding each giant black horse was very high, not to be outdone even by Alavras. If they lost their mounts, it would be difficult for them to be assigned a new one in the short term. They would have to rely on their 2 legs to rush about for missions. He flew towards the place where the sprinting wolf riders were coming from. On the long street, more than 30 riders blocked the road tightly. However, none of these horsemen drew their weapons. Their mission was only to eliminate the secret procurement officer sent by Messias, not to become enemies with King Vixus's Alawira. "Get out of the way." The leader of the riders saw number 37 charging towards the group of horses, and it was clearly too late to rein in his reins. He could only shout at Alavras. However, number 37 didn't stop. Instead, he ran even faster. The streets trembled from the trampling of the horses. Thunder rumbled, covering the exclamations of the crowd not far away. Just as the leader of the riders was at a loss, more than half of the wooden and brick houses on the side of the street suddenly collapsed with a crash. He turned his head in surprise, and a majestic deer with large antlers suddenly appeared in front of him. It was like a tree that had emerged from the horizon. Its branches stretched out, swaying in the wind as it gradually grew larger. Soon, a small forest formed around it. The stag had antlers that were 10 feet wide, and its height was comparable to 2 people stacked on top of each other. Its head was lowered, and its horns were like swords. Dust flew under its hooves, and after smashing through the houses, it plunged into the group of sprinting wolf riders. Bang, bang, bang! Several warhorses were sent flying by this huge creature that suddenly rushed out from the side. The warhorses fell to the ground, their necks broken, and their hooves kicking wildly. On the other hand, the giant antlered deer that had single-handedly stopped the entire charging team was only a little dizzy after the collision. Layers of bone shells had grown out of its neck to disperse the impact of the impact. The deer snorted and shook its slightly cracked antlers. It charged straight at the nearest cavalryman, who pulled out his saber. The rider slashed at its neck, but the stag's momentum didn't decrease. Its antlers pierced into the belly of the rider's mount, and it ruthlessly sent the disemboweled warhorse flying along with its rider. Immediately after, it turned its head and stared at number 37, who was already in front of it with a pair of frosted glass eyes. Ong! The stag let out a strange cry, and its tongue suddenly popped out. This wasn't a tongue that a normal deer could have. It was like a poisonous snake that was ready to strike. On the tip of its tongue, there was a layer of hard shell that emitted a metallic luster. If one were to be poked by this thing, the result would definitely not be pleasant. "Be careful!" a sprinting wolf rider immediately shouted. Although they were instructed by County Governor Messias to get rid of the soft maple assassin, and at the very least, give the two Ilavras a show of strength, the county governor didn't let them kill the two Ilavras. After all, the other party was the envoy of King Vixus. However, it seemed that Ilavra didn't need help. At the last moment before the strange tongue of the deer reached his body, number 37 suddenly leaned his body to the side to avoid the barrage of tongue guns. Moreover, he leaped over the stag's head, and with his hands supporting his neck, he flipped in midair and stood on the back of the deer. His agility was so strong that even acrobats had to admit that they were inferior. The stag snorted and angrily neighed. It turned its head, which was spewing white steam, and wanted to bite the man standing on its back. But at this time, a steel awl suddenly appeared in number 37's hand, and he stabbed it into the eyes of the deer. Immediately after, he jumped again and flipped to the roof of a house on the street. Blood flowed out from the deer's eyes. Its mouth and nose were stained with blood, and the white fur on its face and chest were quickly dyed scarlet. Chapter 1102. It Should Be Rewarded. Keyes suddenly appeared behind the Demon Lord's son, who was watching the show, and commented in an affirmative tone, "It's not good for you to bind it too tightly. Sometimes, those transformed creatures have their own personalities. For example, this giant antlered deer that has fused with part of the hormone glands of the Bugala demonic ape is now struggling to break free from the unreasonable goal you set for it." Arthas was like an injured cat. He quickly teleported away from the spot and then tried to counterattack. However, the situation was a replica of when he faced Messias in the spire. Keyes' voice always sounded behind him, and no matter how he moved or dodged, the voice followed him like a shadow. It had no intention of letting him go. From Wallingsburg to the forest around the city, from the abandoned mine to the warehouse full of grain, from the fishy smell of the fishing port to the sparkling sea, no matter where he went, Arthas could not get rid of the entanglement. "Am I seeing a ghost?" The Demon Lord's son was shocked and afraid. With his knowledge, he did not know how the other party could accurately follow him through the advanced teleportation. He did not know what a quantum life form in the state of non-existence was. He also did not know that Keyes did not leave the window of the spire in Wallingsburg when he was following him like a shadow. He did not know that after following Graz Zt's orders and rashly entering the Ramsey Plain and encountering the Megalosaurus, his fate had become confusing. The demonized giant antlered deer howled. The blood flowing out of its eye socket quickly stopped, and a brand new eyeball popped out of its eye socket. It was just that the size was slightly different from the uninjured eye. In order to grow this eyeball, it had paid a price. Most of the fat stored in its short tail had disappeared. It lifted its front hooves and stomped heavily on the muddy street, then lowered its head and rushed toward the house where number 34 was standing. The huge antlers slammed into the wall, and the latter shattered into pieces like a piece of paper. Oliveira, who was skilled in martial arts, had already jumped high and threw an apple-sized bullet at the roof under his feet. The apple exploded, destroying the beams and other supporting structures of the house. The entire roof collapsed, and the demonized giant-antlered deer was crushed into the ruins. Number 34 landed lightly, and 2 short axes appeared in his hands. He pulled them out from behind his belt, because he felt that he might have to use these 2 brotherly axes soon. Number 34's right eye spun wildly. The special eye catalyzed by biotechnology activated thermal vision. He found that the monster crushed in the ruins had undergone new changes, and its body was constantly twisting. Roar! With a shrill roar and the rustling sound of rocks falling, a brand new giant-antlered deer suddenly appeared in the center of the pile of rubble. It still retained some of the characteristics of a giant-antlered deer, but it did not walk on all fours. Instead, it stood on 2 hind legs that had become thick due to mutation. This also made it more burly than before. It was as tall as 3 people stacked on top of each other. This wild, ugly, and strange giant had sharp antlers and jagged fangs. Its 2 front legs had mutated into 2 abnormally thick arms, like some kind of huge gorilla. Probably relied on its knuckles to walk on the ground when it walked. And when it didn't need to walk, these 2 legs obviously had other uses. It stretched out 2 palms that were about the size of half a roll-up desk and easily grasped 2 pieces of the collapsed ceiling. It raised its hands and threw them to the street. There was no need to aim deliberately. The 2 pieces of ceiling smashed down on several wolf riders who were crowded together. The other piece of ceiling smashed towards number 34, but it was dodged by Alavra's reaction speed and outstanding jumping ability. This scene provoked the monster. Previously, number 34 had pierced its eye with an awl and buried it in the rubble. It was full of resentment toward him. As the monster roared, it kept waving its thick arms. Its pair of forelimbs were like shovels, lifting up the ruins of the buildings around it, forming a curtain made of bricks and wooden pillars. Number 34 could still dodge, but the wolf riders and the other houses on both sides of the street were not so lucky. There were more than 30 wolf riders, and only 7 or 8 of them were able to retreat to the far end of the street. Most of the rest were knocked off their horses by the rubble. Their mounts were even more pitiful. The well-trained high-quality war horses were all paralyzed on the ground and whining. Their bodies were embedded with many rubble and huge wooden thorns. Red blood flowed out from the wounds, mixed with feces and urine due to the shock. The air was filled with a pungent smell. The long street near the city gate had become no different from a slaughterhouse. The monster looked up to the sky and roared. Listening to the sound, it seemed to have a sense of satisfaction. It walked out from the ruins, and from time to time, it would grab a wolf rider that had fallen to the ground. Then, it would bite off an arm or a leg from those people, chewing their flesh with crunching sound. After being demonized, its eating habits were also changed. Although in theory, it was actually an omnivorous creature, but under the circumstances, it still preferred warm flesh and blood, especially the tender flesh of bipedal creatures. It ate to its heart's content. What's going on? Messias looked out from the window of the steeple. Although Valensburg was a city, its scale could not be compared to the cities on the Ramsey continent. Thus, he could vaguely see the commotion near the city gate with his naked eye. The city guards had been alarmed, and almost all of them had rushed out to the area where the monster had appeared. When marching at night, even if they were in familiar city streets, they still had to light up a large number of lamps to illuminate the troops. Looking down from the steeple, the troops were like fire snakes, winding their way to the long street where the incident had occurred. The ringing of the bell brought Messias back to his senses. He did not allow anyone to enter this room in the steeple without permission. In order to prevent certain situations, he had installed a bell in this room. If something urgent happened, the servants guarding the hall would pull on the rope and ring the alarm bell hanging in this room. Messias immediately ran to the elevator and shouted to the servants waiting below the steeple. Someone untied the rope that held the weights and slowly lowered the elevator to the center of the hall. "My lord!" A knight wearing a shiny breastplate walked into the hall and knelt on one knee in front of Messias. He placed one hand on his chest and said, "The sprinting wolf knights are on standby. The wolf cubs can't wait to avenge their fallen brothers." Messias glanced at the commander of the sprinting wolf knights. The other party was just a puppet he had supported. Although the knights were nominally hired by him, the commander of the sprinting wolf knights had always been Messias himself. "Yes, but you have to wait. The sprinting wolf knights are not suited to fighting a monster in the street." Messias was speaking the truth. As a strong light cavalry unit, the sprinting wolf knights had always been trained to harass and hunt down scattered soldiers in the wilderness. They were not suited for street fighting. "I understand, my lord, but—" The commander of the knights was also at a loss for words. The sprinting wolf knights were formed and trained by Messias himself. Every rider could be said to be the trusted aide of the sheriff. They were usually arrogant because of this. A few days ago, another cavalry unit was lost in the birch forest near Cachalin. Today, another cavalry unit was scattered in their headquarters, Valensburg. These two defeats in a row were very difficult for the conceited sprinting wolf knights to accept. As the leader of the puppet knights, it wasn't an easy task for him to suppress the restless wolf cubs. However, before he could finish his words, he was interrupted by another visitor. Magistrate Messias. The man wore a dark green robe and a white linen gown underneath. His attire revealed his identity without a doubt. "Deacon," Messias replied simply. "You shouldn't have come at this time," he added inwardly at the same time. As one of the 6 feudal lords of the southern country of Tapt, Messias was well aware of the importance of alliances. Not only did he have allies in the abyss, this man also had his own allies in various fields. Even in the city of Druids who were loyal to King Vixith, there were still some people who had connections with him in some way. "The elder is dead." The man calmly stared at Messias, a trace of fear on his face, but it quickly disappeared. Messias frowned. Wasn't this matter already known in the afternoon? Not only was this man present at the time, but he also summoned the relief knights to stop the assassins. More importantly, before this dramatic scene took place, the two of them had already discussed it. "I'm very sad," Messias said. "Everyone is sad, but the future generations have other things to do." Seeing that the deacon did not shy away from his words, Messias could only temporarily dismiss the commander of the sprinting wolf knights. "The congregation needs to elect a new elder to guide the construction of Valensburg and the surrounding territories. And I urgently need a persuasive supporter like you." Hearing the deacon's words, Messias suddenly felt a little more relaxed. He thought that some difficult problem was about to be thrown in front of him. Who would have thought that a business deal would be delivered to his door? "I'm very willing to support you, even if it means going with you to the congregation to participate in the voting. But as you probably know, a monster has appeared on the streets of Valensburg, and I really can't leave." "In half an hourglass," the deacon interrupted again, "I'll help you clean up the mess. On the streets of the city, our strength can be fully utilized. Neither Ilavra nor that monster can affect the appearance of Valensburg. Then I'll set off immediately to participate in the congregation's voting. In 1 hourglass, I'll personally write your name on the book of the great builder. Thank you. Mutual benefit." Chapter 1103. Harriman stroked Radish's bristling mane. This fine horse was clearly uneasy. Explosions and cries of shock came from the street not far from the city gate. Apart from that, there was also a strange roar of a beast. "I have to make some preparations. Don't be like the last battle, where I can't get the potion," Harriman thought. He carefully opened the satchel on the horse's back and took out a small glass bottle filled with some blue liquid. He then slid it into a secret pocket sewn into his sleeve. Originally, he wanted to inform Old Weather and let this old servant be more alert. If the situation was not right, he had to escape first. However, Old Weather was currently hunched over, his entire body hidden behind the figure of his old horse. His 2 hands were crossed in his sleeves, and his aura was somewhat strange. Harriman knew that the reason his father sent Old Weather to follow him was probably not just because this old fellow could write. So mysterious. Harriman muttered in his heart as he pulled Radish's reins and took 2 steps forward. At this moment, many farmers and merchants who were originally waiting in line to leave the city were protesting, wanting to squeeze out of the city gate together. After all, the commotion not far away did not make them feel at ease. Moreover, these people were not locals of Valensburg, so naturally, they did not have any feelings for this city. Number 27 sat upright on the horse's back, and another huge black horse belonging to number 34 stood beside her. The 2 huge black horses stood in the center of the road, taking up a third of the way out of the city. The mechanical magical pet named Black Nose on her shoulder had already disappeared, and no one knew where it had run off to. At this moment, if someone dared to stare into her eyes, they might be able to see strange reflections. Warning: Abyssal demons aura detected. Warning: opponent suspected to possess spell-like abilities. Warning: suspected signs of demon order activity. A series of notifications sounded in number 27's built-in bone conduction cochlea. These were the results of the analysis obtained by the mechanical magical pet, Black Nose, when it gathered samples near the battlefield. And these conclusions gave number 27 a bad feeling in her heart. Previously, although she already had some prejudice against Wallingsburg under Macius's rule, she was still unwilling to believe that there would be such a degenerate place in the southern country of Tap. Abyssal demons, demon order, these were all terms that Alaveras had only heard of in books and classes. The teacher who taught them had once clearly explained the meaning of these terms. Abyssal demons are otherworldly creatures from the bottomless abyss, and the demon cult is a cult that worships the power of demons. They are the great enemies of all humans. Whether it's Tapt or the Ramsey continent, humans have the same attitude toward these things. Whenever they are discovered, it usually means that the seeds of disaster have sprouted. The best outcome is to cut off the meat in time to stop the damage and prevent them from spreading throughout the country. Cut the meat to stop the loss. Number 27 narrowed her eyes as she recalled the term she heard during Alaveras training. The question is, how much meat do we have to cut to stop the loss? Thinking of this, she suddenly made a decision. First, she used the short-range communicator implanted in her body to send a short message to number 34. Then, she pulled out a rechargeable wand from the saddle hook and aimed it at the city gate behind her. Fet! She whispered the activation spell. Following her soft cry, a fist-sized fireball suddenly shot out from the tip of the wand and landed on the wooden lever of the iron fence of the city gate in an instant. With a loud bang, the lever was blasted into 2 by the fireball. The iron fence fell down with a clatter, perfectly fitting into the preset depression on the ground. Immediately after, number 27 chanted another spell, but the accent was slightly different from the fet just now. The bottom of the iron fence was instantly heated, softened, and then melted by the spell. When it cooled down, it would be stuck in the hole in the stone of the city gate, unable to be lifted by the iron chain. Unless the entire iron fence was removed, there was no way for people to pass through the city gate. "What are you doing?" The sergeant guarding the city gate questioned number 27 loudly. He unsheathed the long sword at his waist, and several crossbowmen followed behind him. The halberd guards who had been suppressing the crowd near the city gate also turned their spearheads and aimed at number 27. "To prevent you from doing anything stupid," number 27 said coldly and then pulled the reins. The black horse raised its front hooves high in the air and drew a semicircle in the air, forcing the sergeant to duck and dodge. By the order of King Vixith, from now on, the city defense of Valensburg will be temporarily taken over by the Oliveira Legion. I order you to disperse the crowd at the city gate. Before the new order is given, no one is allowed to enter or leave Valensburg. As she spoke, Number 27 raised her hand and pointed at the bricks of Valensburg's city gate. A shield-shaped insignia immediately appeared on the wall. In the middle of the shield was a sword perpendicular to the ground. This was the family insignia of King Vixeth. Every major city within the borders of the kingdom was built by the Druid faction, and such insignia was reserved on the walls of important buildings. Only those with the permission of King Vixeth and the secret key and ciphertext could reveal it and use it to prove that they were the king's emissaries. Therefore, when number 27 summoned this insignia, no matter how much the sergeants at the gate complained, they had to obey number 27's orders at this moment. Although the sergeant guarding the city gate of Valensburg was definitely one of Magistrate Messias's trusted aides, he still couldn't disobey number 27 without his lord's permission, because she was exercising the king's authority. "Yes, madam," the sergeant replied loudly. Then, he turned his head and looked at the people in the queue, including Haramond. "Didn't you hear what this madam just said? Before the city gate opens, no one can pass through here." Among the peasants who were preparing to leave the city at night, a small-scale protest broke out. They shouted and cursed in a low voice. However, facing the halberds and spears pointed at them, they could only choose to compromise. Many people pushed carts and carried poles, trying to bypass the rioting streets and find a place to stay before the curfew. Haramond and Old Weasel also led their horses and hurriedly left this troublesome place. Ignoring the sergeant major who was purposely making things difficult for her, number 27 pulled on the reins of the giant black horse again. The mount under her, as well as the one she was leading, which belonged to number 34, immediately turned around and charged towards the tall walls near the city gates. "That bitch wants to," the sergeant's eyes widened in shock. As it turned out, just as the two black horses were about to hit the wall, they jumped up at almost the same time. Then, the two horses' front hooves landed on the wall. Then, they actually started to gallop on top of the wall. Due to the craftsmanship of the construction, the base of the wall was much wider than the top, and the surface of the wall was actually not perpendicular to the ground, but rather shaped like a trapezoid. However, galloping on top of the wall was still a magical sight that the sergeant could not understand. Looking at the direction that number 27 was galloping in, the sergeant deduced that the king's envoy's destination was the other way out of Valensburg. "Quickly go to the stables and ride a horse to report to the governor. Tell him that an Alavera has already sealed off the city gate and is now running towards the water gate." The sergeant pulled a guard over and whispered a few words into his ear, telling him to quickly report the situation to Messias. Unlike the city gate here, the water gate was specially prepared for the various large guilds in Valensburg. There was an endless stream of merchant ships coming in and out every day. After these merchant ships paid the fees to enter and exit the city, they could enter and exit the water gate through a specially repaired and widened waterway. They could travel between the docks in the city and the large river 2 miles outside the city that flowed directly to the seaside. The fees that merchant ships had to pay were much higher than the fees that farmers had to pay through the city gate. Even the smallest merchant ship had to pay at least 5 silver cubes. The taxes collected by the water gate were one of the most important sources of income for Messias. These merchant ships were also the main source of Valensburg's foreign trade. Even the slightest interruption might cause the various large guilds in the city to be unhappy, and could even threaten Messias's rule. Therefore, when the sergeant saw number 27 running towards the water gate, he immediately sent someone to deliver the message so that the governor could be prepared. However, what he did not know was that Messias had too many urgent matters to deal with at the moment. He really did not have the time to listen to a messenger's report. Although a deacon of the city's Druid conclave had already reached a deal with him, Messias could not be completely at ease before the deal was completed. At the very least, he had to withdraw the city's garrison troops that were engaged in close combat with the monsters to prevent unnecessary losses from the conclave. After all, every member of the city's garrison was a professional soldier that he, Messias, had spent real money to train. Losing even one of them would cause him great heartache. When there were only 10 steps between the two sides, the assault team of the Wallensburg garrison army raised their shields and blocked in front of them. When the two sides were only 5 steps away, the assault team threw short spears at the monster, and then rushed forward without thinking. The soldiers' boots slipped on the wet ground, but they quickly stabilized themselves. The soldiers in the front row maintained their squatting position and pushed the monsters in front of them with all their might. Their arms also felt the recoil from the monster's attack. The shields of the second and third rows of soldiers covered the heads of the soldiers in the front row. Those trapped in the shadows could hear the echoes of the monster's attacks on the shields. The soldiers in the front row of the shield formation took every opportunity to stab their swords into the gaps between the shields, hoping that the tip of their swords would be able to tear through the enemy's flesh. Chapter 1104. The city guards of Wallensburg were already engaged in battle with the monster. So where did number 34 Oliveira go? As it turned out, after the remaining wolf riders had retreated in panic, there were no longer any unsightly bystanders. Number 34 displayed his specialty. The bulging clothes wrapped around his body were constantly torn apart and reassembled. This Oliveira who specialized in assault changed his appearance in the blink of an eye. Seeing the city guards coming from afar, number 34 immediately disguised himself as one of them. As long as the captain of the city guards didn't recognize people by their faces, number 34's disguise would be impossible to see through under the cover of the night. Reality proved this point. Not only did he successfully blend into their team, he was also arranged to be the first batch of assault team members in the tortoiseshell shield formation. Unlike what most people imagined, unless they were at the end of their rope, commanders rarely ordered their troops to form the tortoiseshell shield formation in the wild. This kind of formation was most often used in sieges and street battles. The advantage of using the tortoiseshell shield formation was that it provided a relatively safe and enclosed space for the soldiers. However, because the tortoiseshell shield formation itself limited the soldiers' tactical movements and vision, wise commanders rarely ordered the formation of the tortoiseshell shield formation in a large-scale battle. Moreover, forming the formation was a technical skill. Not all soldiers could easily master it. Normally, only professional soldiers who had been trained regularly could form the tortoiseshell shield formation that had a certain degree of tactical difficulty. For example, the city guards of Wallensburg. They had to train every other day, so they were no strangers to fighting in formations. Usually, they relied on the tortoiseshell shield formation to suppress the gangs that caused trouble. However, they weren't facing bandits who would flee in all directions after being killed. Instead, they were facing a monster that was as tall as a 2-story building. The captain of the city guards organized 2 tortoiseshell shield formation assault teams to intercept the monster from both sides of the street. However, it was clearly not enough to suppress the monster. Not long after, number 34, who was hiding in the formation, heard the sound of the shield shattering and smelled the scent of fresh blood. Fortunately, the long-term training had shown result. The city guards of Wallensburg had a much higher fighting spirit than number 34 expected. Not only did they not retreat after the shields in the front row were shattered, number 34 even saw some of them pick up the horn pot in front of them and gulp down a mouthful of something. Then, their faces became redder and redder due to anger. In the end, they all let out a roar that could shatter bones. Some of them even threw down the shields in their hands and charged straight at the monster. The standard weapons of the city guards were spears. However, the assault team members in the tortoiseshell shield formation would normally use short spears or broad short swords that was convenient. Most of the commandos who drank the diluted version of the Bull's Strength potion were young lads at the front. Although they weren't as well as the tortoiseshell shield formation as well, they had better stamina, and they had better eyes. After drinking a pot of medicine, These people who were filled with strength immediately turned into fearless berserkers. They sacrificed their lives and fought against the monsters. They're good soldiers, but… Number 34's eyes flickered as he thought to himself. It's a pity. More than a dozen commandos who had given up their lives and drank the diluting potion of Ox's strength would definitely be able to turn the tide of a battle between dozens or even hundreds of people. However, the enemy they were facing now wasn't human. The bone conduction device in number 34's ear had received the message from number 27. He had learned that the monster had been corrupted and transformed by the Abyss Demon. Previously, the monster that had the characteristics of a bighorn deer and a berserk ape had only shown physical strength. However, number 34 knew what the Abyss Demon was. There was no way this monster only had this much ability. It probably had some spell-like abilities that it hadn't used yet. However, there were many types of Abyss Demons, and each of them had different spell-like abilities. Even though number 34 had been trained in the study of demons, he still couldn't figure out the enemy's abilities at a glance. Hopefully, these dozen people can force the monster to use spell-like abilities, number 34 prayed in his heart. Although these soldiers were Messias's subordinates, they were, in essence, soldiers under King Vixeth. As long as the county governor's problem was solved, these well-trained soldiers would definitely be able to win glory in the upcoming war against the Yomians and Soft Maple invaders. That would be more in line with King Vixeth's interests. The power of chaos continued to rise. Coupled with the many wounds on its body, the demonized monster's mind gradually became clearer. Its intelligence was originally similar to that of a bighorn deer, but it kept increasing. Pain was the best teacher, and chaos was its source of motivation. In the beginning, it only relied on its thick skin and immense strength to deal with the attacks of those small people. Gradually, it learned some other things. Perhaps this wasn't too accurate. That was because those dodging postures, controlling the muscles to close the wound, and the techniques to better use the two ape arms to perform punches, were all things that appeared in its mind in a flash of inspiration, and it could master them to the point of perfection in 1 or 2 breaths. With one punch, it knocked down a little bean that had stabbed a sharp short spear into its lower abdomen. It casually pulled out a short spear that was about the length of its forearm, and the wound was immediately closed by its knotted muscles. It held the short spear in its huge fist as if it was holding a wooden spike. With a flip of its hand, it used the short spear to skewer another soldier who had climbed onto its back and was about to swing his sword at its neck. Then, it brought the soldier who couldn't help but scream to its mouth and used its sharp teeth to viciously tear off one of the soldier's arms. Crunch, crunch. Even in the battlefield where all sorts of sounds were mixed together, the chewing sound still stimulated everyone's nerve. To this monster, chewing was just an instinct. Flesh was sweet, and it could only taste the sweetness in large mouthfuls. It felt that as it ate, the fatigue in its body and the pain from its wounds were quickly fading away. Apart from that, it also felt that its chest was a little itchy, so it used its huge palm to scratch its chest. With a ripping sound that sounded like silk, the skin on the monster's chest was suddenly torn apart by itself. It couldn't help but be stunned for a moment, but it soon grinned and laughed. It turned out that on its chest that was covered by dark and dirty fur, there was a huge mouth that was half the size of a human. The mouth was like a vertical eye, and there were countless barb-like fangs on the eyelid. A scarlet tongue that was stained with dark green mucus and covered in barbs drooped down from the corner of its mouth like a long snake slithering out of its hole. With a swoosh, the long tongue curled around the meatball that was skewered by the wooden spike in the monster's hand and immediately cut it into pieces. The tongue was extremely agile. It twisted and curled up a few large chunks of minced meat before it quickly retracted back into the huge mouth on its chest. With this extra mouth, its eating efficiency increased by many times. This is the characteristic of the Bugula demonic ape. Number 34's eyes narrowed. gorilla arms, upright feet, and a huge mouth on its chest. These obvious physiological characteristics allowed him to roughly guess which kind of abyssal demon bloodline this demonized monster had inherited. So, seeing this, number 34 recalled the relevant knowledge he learned in demonic studies classes. He immediately decided to use the correct method to deal with this enemy, which he used to deal with the Bugala demonic ape. He quickly escaped from the tortoiseshell formation. In fact, the shield formation had already disintegrated after the failed assault. Therefore, even though number 34 was in the center of the shield formation, it didn't take him much effort to escape. A deserter? When the captain of the guards in charge of supervising the battle saw this scene, he thought number 34 was going to run away. He rushed over with 2 guards with halberds in their hands. However, they were still half a beat too slow. Number 34 jumped high after he escaped from the shield formation. With a hook of his palm, he successfully grabbed the eaves of a building on the street and flipped over to the roof. The clothes on his body were torn apart and reassembled. Soon, he was back in Alavera's ordinary military uniform. Then, number 34 hammered his chest twice, and at the same time, a long string of syllables that ordinary people couldn't understand came out of his mouth. He used the only 2 abyssal words he knew to challenge the monster, who obviously had the bloodline of the Bugala demonic ape. Although the abyssal inhabitants often became the claws of powerful demons or demon lords, the Bugala demonic ape was actually not a demon. Some scholars classified such monsters as primitive demons, such as the demon-hunting spider and the 3-headed snake. Perhaps one day, they would complete their supernatural evolution and transform into a new, complete Tana re-demon, but they had not achieved this point yet. The reason why the Bugala demonic ape was classified as primitive demons, not the Obilus demons, was not only because scholars had not found a specific type of fallen soul that could give birth to the Bugala demonic ape. The Tana re-demons were all fallen souls in various material planes in the multiverse transformed in the abyss, but also because the Bugala demonic ape had the characteristics of a naturally evolved community. The powerful Tana re-demons could only rule and command other demons through violence and fear. They did not have the concept of community. In the abyss, the Bugala demonic ape would often form small communities like the apes in the prime material plane. The leader of this community was the most powerful warrior, or an individual designated by the powerful demon that the community served. The struggle between the communities was part of a complex hierarchy, which was difficult for non-Bugala demonic ape demons to understand. However, some demonic scholars came to the conclusion that the Bugala ape demons would obtain spoils of war from public killings, and these spoils would be given to the leader of the community to enjoy first. If the other Bugala ape demons in the community had doubts, then they would have to redetermine the hierarchy through battle. That was what number 34 was doing now. He issued a challenge to the monster who was eating the bodies of the city guards of Warlensburg. If it really had the bloodline of the Bugala demonic ape, according to the characteristics of that monster, it would not turn a blind eye to it. Chapter 1105. The monster threw a short spear at number 34's feet. This was its response to the challenge. Number 34 hurriedly dodged to the side, and after dodging the short spear, which smashed a large piece of roof tiles, he landed heavily on the street. He rolled to the side to reduce the impact, and after getting up, he sprinted into the distance without looking back. Thanks to the city guards who had purposely evacuated the crowd, there was no one in front of number 34. Because the monster had just been challenged, it ignored the guards who tried to stop it. One big and one small, one in front and one behind. One was a cyborg, and the other was a mutated monster. It was as if the 2 of them were running a race, one chasing the other down the long street to the square in the center of Valensburg. All the houses and shops they passed by closed their doors and windows in advance. "Stop! Don't come any closer!" Before number 34 reached the entrance of the Messias family mansion, the family guards outside the fortress yelled at number 34. Then, without waiting for number 34 to respond, the archers among the guards fired a volley of arrows at him. Dozens of arrows whistled uneasily as they fell at the same time. Number 34 quickly raised his hands and crossed them above his head. His two wrist guards split open with a whoosh and stretched out into two oval-shaped shields. When the arrows landed on them, they could only produce clanking sounds and clusters of sparks. The person in charge of commanding the Messias family guards was a man in his 40s. He was tall and sturdy, and his head was clearly shaved. Now, there was a messy gray stubble. Although he had a frightening physique and a ferocious appearance, it was clear that he had received education from the way he spoke when he was commanding the troops. Furthermore, he was quick-witted and had a clear understanding of the strength of the family mansion's defenses. He was not blinded by the sudden attack. Seeing that the crossbows could not stop number 34's footsteps, the man immediately ordered a guard beside him to blow a bronze horn. The rhythmic sound of the horn transmitted some kind of message. In an instant, the entire mansion seemed to have come alive. More than 100 armed family guards walked up to their respective defensive positions in an orderly manner. Soon, the mansion that was also used for military purposes revealed the appearance of a fortress. Number 34 dodged a large number of arrows by running at high speed, while those that couldn't be dodged were blocked by the shields on his wrists. As for the monster that was following closely behind him, it didn't even try to block or dodge the toothpick-like arrows. However, with number 34's hearing, he did not hear the noises when the arrowheads dug into the flesh despite the interference of the shrieking arrows. His skin is really tough, number 34 thought to himself. However, that guy still hadn't used the advanced teleportation spell, an abyssal demon's specialty, so it probably didn't have this kind of spell-like ability. This was good news. In the span of 7 or 8 breaths, number 34 finally arrived at the Messias family's mansion. The guards on the wall no longer drew their bows and shot arrows. Instead, they picked up their axes and halberds that had sharp protrusions at the top, and began to stab and hack at the enemy from above. Number 34 didn't raise his shield to block this time. He jumped to the side with all his might. 6 chains with sharp claws suddenly drilled out from the gaps in his clothes behind him. They grabbed the corners of the wall and carried number 34 over the wall like a swing, drawing an arc in the air as they fell into the mansion. The 6 chains were like the tentacles of an octopus. They were abnormally agile and powerful. They grabbed the walls, pillars, and bronze statues in the garden of the Messias family's mansion. They carried number 34 over the crowd, the houses, and the blooming heather. Finally, they arrived at the tall steeple at the back of the mansion. With the help of the 6 chains, number 34 climbed to the top of the steeple at an extremely fast speed. The monster behind him, on the other hand, was not as graceful and agile as him. Even though it had managed to charge into the Messias family's mansion, it could only rely on its 2 powerful hind legs and thick forearms to climb over the walls. Otherwise, it would have to bend down and use its antlers to clear a path, completely destroying the weak obstacles and collapsing them. Then, it would have to walk through the ruins. It could be said that most of the attacks of the Messias family's guards ended up landing on this demonized monster. Of course, they also paid the price of more than a dozen casualties. Moreover, this didn't include the injuries of the cooks, gardeners, and other servants who were accidentally injured because they couldn't dodge in time. As for the financial losses caused by the monster's crossing, no one had the time to calculate them yet. How did they get in here? Hearing the commotion outside, Messias strode out of the hall at the bottom of the steeple and saw a monster charging at him. More than 20 loyal family guards immediately stood in front of the patriarch, blocking him in 2 rows. The people in the front row were holding infantry tower shields. They wedged the shields into the cracks in the floor tiles and leaned on the shields for support. The people in the back row were all holding spears that were more than 12 feet long. The bottom of the spear was pressed against the ground. The spear shaft was placed in the groove on the upper edge of the shield, and the tip of the spear was raised. Messias didn't move. He only had a crossbow in his hand, with an explosive rune engraved on it. The county head didn't want to show the slightest bit of cowardice in front of his subordinates, but when he saw the monster charging at the shield wall, his palms couldn't help but sweat a lot. Although the monster easily knocked over the shield wall, its body was pierced by 17 or 18 bloody holes by the 12-feet-long spear. Messias aimed at its head and fired the explosive rune engraved on the crossbow. Bang. When the crossbow arrow was about to hit its head, the monster suddenly twisted its neck, and the crossbow arrow hit its tree-like antlers. The explosive crossbow bolt directly blew off half of the long horn on its head. Dark red blood spurted out from the broken horn. The monster's head also had many scorch marks that had been scorched by the flames. Roar! The monster roared into the sky. Some family guards who could still fight hurriedly used their spears to stab its neck, but the tip of the spear was blocked by a circle of bone plate hidden under the fur on its neck. Just as the monster went berserk and was about to flatten the little beans that had harmed it, number 34, who had climbed halfway up the spire, suddenly roared out a series of words in the abyssal language at the monster. Just like before, he was challenging the monster. Therefore, the monster ignored the family guards who were stabbing it. It even temporarily set aside its hatred for the explosive crossbow arrow that Messias shot at its thigh, causing its short tail to be blown apart. It used its two thick palms with sharp nails to climb up the steeple in front of it with its hind hooves that had great friction. One had to admit that the monster's climbing ability was truly astonishing. Its climbing technique was like that of an ape, but also like that of a mountain goat that walked on cliffs all year round. Even though number 34 had 6 chain claws and was as nimble as a spider, in terms of climbing speed alone, that Sergeant Alawira was still no match for this monster. Between the two, another race of speed was played out. Due to the uniqueness of the racetrack, not only could the people around the street see the race, but all the residents of Valensburg could see the two foreign objects crawling on the steeple from afar. The mansion of the Messias family was brightly lit. Huge candles made of high-quality oil were lit at the top of the defensive towers at the protruding parts of the mansion. The light was then reflected by the large mirrors onto the snow-white steeple. These candles and mirrors were originally defensive searchlights, so the light that shone out was stable and straight, almost chasing number 34 and the monster all the way up. Looking up at the two figures, one big and one small, who had climbed dozens of feet, Messias stopped the family guards from shooting with crossbows and even ballistae. He turned his head to look at a man in a dark green robe, who was much slower than him, and had just walked out of the hall at the base of the steeple. Lord Deacon. Messias emphasized the word deacon to remind the members of the city's Druid conclave that the deal between them had not been fulfilled. I hope you can take care of these bastards who offended my honor. Leave no one alive. He gritted his teeth as he spoke. The city's Druid nodded slightly. The firelight left mottled shadows on his face, making it difficult for others to see his face clearly. Of course, Lord Sheriff, he replied. After all, both your time and mine is precious. With that, the city's Druid began to chant an incantation. After a short burst of explosions, he suddenly raised his hand and pointed at the towering steeple. The strength of a Druid lay in the environment. Naturally, the city's Druid would be able to unleash his abilities better in the city. In particular, every blade of grass and every tree in Valensburg was designed and built by the city's Druid conclave. As the deacon finished his incantation, the outer walls of the steeple suddenly changed. Stone pillars as thick as beams quickly shot out from the outer walls of the steeple. Number 34 might be able to dodge the attack by relying on his smaller body, but there was no way the massive monster that was following him could dodge the attack. Several stone pillars shot out and slammed into the monster's abdomen like a boxer punching a fist. The cracks in the bricks of the steeple under its feet and its palms were twisted and deformed, making it difficult for it to hold on. Every time it tried to swing upwards using the stone pillars, the pillars would shrink back into the steeple, and the places where they disappeared would become seamless. It was impossible to tell that there was something protruding out of the steeple. However, the bloodline of the Bugala demonic ape not only gave this monster great stamina and resistance to physical attacks, but its climbing skills were also astonishing. Although there were many dangerous situations, it was always able to get through them without any mishap. Then, it continued to chase after number 34 and continued to climb upward. The deacon wanted to force the two of them to fall to their deaths from the outer walls of the steeple, but he always came close. "Well then, I'll make it more difficult for you two bastards," the deacon cursed in his heart as he chanted another incantation. Chapter 1106. Following the deacon's imagination, the stone pillars on the outer walls of the steeple retreated, leaving behind a pile of rubble. What replaced the surface of the steeple was many densely packed tiny spikes, which could not be seen clearly from afar. However, there were other changes that even the guards on the outer walls of Valensburg could see. The entire steeple was divided into more than 50 different layers, and each layer was rotating. The two adjacent layers were rotating in opposite directions, like pieces of rapidly rotating millstones. When these millstones began to rotate, one of the monster's hands happened to be stuck in between two layers. The rotating millstones and the dense spikes on them crushed a section of the monster's finger under the cutting force. In an instant, the monster let out a miserable cry that could be heard throughout Valensburg. In pain, it lost its grip, and its huge body fell a long distance. At this moment, it was about 200 feet from the ground. If it fell, it would be severely injured even if it did not die. Thus, as the monster slid down, not only did it use its sharp claws to dig into the walls of the steeple, it also used its hooves to stomp on the ground to stop its fall. On the snow-white outer walls of the steeple, there was a trail of dark red blood stains. However, in the end, it managed to find a foothold and hung onto its huge body. In this process, the huge mouth on its chest also made some contributions. The long tongue inside secreted a large amount of mucus, which was constantly sprayed into the gaps between the various layers of the steeple. The mucus quickly dried, and thus fixed the rotating outer walls of the steeple, making it easier for the monster to dig into the outer walls of the steeple, creating holes for it to grab onto. It was now hanging on the two adjacent layers, its hooves stepping on the lower layer, and its powerful upper limbs grabbing onto the holes in the upper layer. The two layers of the millstone-like steeple were tightly glued together by the mucus, no longer rotating. Like many others, Harriman was also surprised as he watched the chase on the outer walls of Valensburg's steeple. However, unlike those who were mainly there to watch the show, he saw something. In particular, the scene of the deacon of the Druid faction casting spells and changing the shape of the spire to resist the enemy allowed the intelligent Harriman to more or less guess the inside story. The relief knight that appeared in the audience hall when the people were petitioning during the day, the transformation of the outer walls of the spire when the demonized monsters and modified humans ascended the spire. Harriman could not help but look at the surrounding streets with a suspicious gaze. Is it only Messias's mansion that has such a layout, or is the entire Valensburg built by the church controlled by the city druids? If it was only the former, it could be explained by the fact that Messias had added extra security measures to his house. If the latter was the case, it meant that the entire city of Valensburg could become a terrifying war machine when necessary. If the Soft Maple Expeditionary Army wanted to capture the city, it was almost certain that they would have to fight a siege or street battle. The city that suddenly came to life would definitely be a fatal blow to their army. Even if the Expeditionary Army captured the city in the end, the losses on their side would drive them crazy. In the end, Mayor Grisus and the other members of the Soft Maple Council would most likely order, burn their houses and salt their land. That King Vexeth is really generous. Harriman sighed in his heart. Through what he had seen during the day of prayer, he knew that the Druid faction in that city was not under the jurisdiction of the fief. They were loyal to King Vexeth. He guessed that the far-sighted monarch of the southern kingdom of Taput had probably expected such a day to come. That was why he had supported the development of the Druid faction in the past few decades, and the latter had contributed more than a dozen cities like Valensburg to him. Each of these cities was a living fortress. Even if they were breached, they would still cause great damage to the invaders. And as long as the invaders burned the city out of anger and killed people, the power brought by the hatred would be fed back to the people of the country. Link after link, King Vexeth's plan was like a spider's web, both complex and effective. "Young master, we should go now." Seeing that Harriman was still staring at the distant spire in a daze, Old Weasel, who was sent by Grimm to record the entire process of his coming-of-age ceremony, could only remind him. He had just used the bag of silver coins Harriman had given him to buy 2 passenger seats and the right to ride on a transport ship belonging to the Textile Guild. This was a huge sum of money, and the captain of the ship was obviously raising the price. But this could not be helped. At the water gate of Valensburg, the representatives of the various guilds were confronting the same woman. Dozens of guild guards pulled out their swords, and some even took out their bows and muskets. Not only did Oliveira, who rode on a huge black horse, give them immense pressure, but he also gave them orders that they could not obediently follow. Otherwise, they would not want to confront that woman. I've said it before. By the decree of King Vexeth, the city defense of Wallingsburg will be temporarily handled by the Oliveira Legion. Number 27 looked at the crowd in front of her with disdain. A revolving flintlock cannon had appeared in her hand. From time to time, she would aim the cannon at the hostile guards, causing them to tremble in fear. "This water gate must be closed. Before we receive the next order, no one can enter or leave the city." In the crowd, a stout guild representative wearing a tasseled shirt opened his mouth and said, "My lord, you may not know this, but this guild pier and the 60 yards of waterway outside the city are all the private property of Magistrate Messias. It does not fall under the jurisdiction of Valensburg. The various merchant guilds have rented the right to use it from the magistrate, and we have a document as proof." As he spoke, he held up a piece of yellowed parchment with some torn edges. However, the parchment had a layer of wax on it, and the terms on it were still rather clear. "This pier is the lifeline of the various guilds' trade. We need to use it to send and receive goods day and night. Even if it is only for a single night, the delay in the delivery of goods will result in a huge penalty. The guilds may be able to bear it, but the small merchants that rely on the guilds for survival will definitely not be able to bear it. They will instantly go bankrupt because of your orders, and their families might even be separated." That person's words were forceful and reasonable, and received the support of many other guild representatives. Number 27 frowned when he saw this. Even though she had temporarily taken over Valensburg's defense, the problem of Magistrate Messias had yet to be solved, and it was still difficult for her to command the entire city's garrison. At the very least, she could not mobilize the city's garrison to suppress these guilds apart from using her personal strength. Looking at the short canal in the distance, while Number 27 and the guild representatives were in a standoff, small cargo ships began to move quickly towards the water gate. These small cargo ships often carried merchants who wanted to leave Wallingsburg to avoid trouble when things went south. Number 27 suspected that there might be demon worshippers hidden among these people, or spies that the invaders had sent into the city. Her eyes scanned the surface of the river, and her modified eyes gave her night vision. A cargo ship with 2 livestock standing in the cabin suddenly attracted Number 27's attention. I saw these 2 horses at the city gates just now. Number 27's mind raced as she recalled the scene she saw not long ago. She did not pay much attention to Harriman and Old Weather at that time. But their owners wanted to leave the city by land, and the city gates were blocked. They actually came to the water gate so quickly. How much do they want to leave the city? These 2 horses aren't carrying any goods, and one of them looks like a military horse that was specially bred for battle. Number 27's eyes narrowed as she thought of this. She was determined to stop the small cargo ship with the banner of the Textile Guild. Let's stop it first. Those 2 people are most likely suspicious. Once they are attacked and exposed, I can use facts to shut the mouths of these guild representatives. Therefore, ignoring the guild representative who kept arguing with her about terms like ownership and right to rent, Number 27 used her modified eyes to quickly measure the distance between her and the small cargo ship. She then raised her revolver, raised the muzzle to a specific angle with the ground, and quickly pulled the trigger. Bang! A round cannonball about the size of a pear flew out from the muzzle of the cannon. It arced through the air in a parabola and accurately landed on the cargo ship that was about 200 yards away from her. "What the hell are you doing?" The few guild representatives were shocked when they saw number 27 open fire. However, when they realized that number 27 was not shooting at them, they quickly stopped the guild guards from attacking. No matter what, this freak Olivera was a subordinate of King Vixith, and she had already proven her identity through the emblem. If they attacked her for no reason, even with Magistrate Macius' mediation, if King Vixith insisted on holding them accountable, these guilds would not be able to bear the consequences. Open your eyes wide. Number 27 ignored them and quickly moved the revolver of her revolver. Take a good look at who is on that ship. Also, where is the representative of the Textile Guild? Why don't you explain it to me yourself? Are those 2 members of your guild? Don't play dumb. Chapter 1107. The cannonball fired by number 27 accurately hit the mast of the Textile Guild's small cargo ship. The wooden mast, which was as thick as a bowl, broke into 2 with a "kacha" sound. The mast with the square sail drooped down, and almost all of it fell into the canal. Harriman and Old Weather looked at each other and stood up at the same time. Under the surprised gaze of the ship owner, they pulled the 2 horses and jumped out of the cabin. The place where they entered the water was less than 10 yards away from the water gate. Whether it was a horse or a person who knew how to swim, they could easily swim over. As long as they got out of the water gate, the horses would be able to carry the 2 of them and quickly leave the area of influence of Valensburg. However, anyone with a discerning eye would be able to tell at a glance that the 2 of them were not in the right state of mind to rush out of Valensburg in such a hurry when they were being obstructed. In fact, among the representatives of the various guilds who were confronting number 27, the representative of the Textile Guild immediately felt that he was in a difficult position. Those 2 are not from our guild. They should be passengers who came here temporarily. The cargo ships of the guilds were not always full of goods. Sometimes, due to cost considerations, it was not surprising that they would carry some passengers. But now, no one was willing to stand up for the Textile Guild. The other guild representatives even moved their feet slightly and stood further away. Close the gate. Close the water gate. Ignoring the representative who was still trying to defend himself, number 27, who seized the initiative, shouted at the guards on the water gate without hesitation. These people were not part of the city's garrison, nor were they the guards of the various guilds. Instead, they were the guards of Magistrate Macius's household. Originally, they would not have bothered with number 27, Olivera. These people were stationed at the water gate to protect the private property of the feudal lord, Magistrate Macius. The representatives of the various guilds led their guards to confront number 27, and these people watched the show from afar. But even they could tell that Harriman and Old Weather's actions of swimming out of the city gate were not normal. Therefore, number 27's shout immediately woke up the guards on the water gate, and they involuntarily chose to follow his orders. Crock, 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 as the guards on the water gate worked together to turn the winch, two doors made of cast iron and oak planks treated with asphalt as the main body, installed with parallel sliding rails on both sides, and covered with a layer of iron nails on the outside, slowly fell into the river from the bridge-like city gate of the water gate. If the water gate was sealed, unless 5 people worked together to pull the winch up, it would be difficult to open it again. The city's Druid Guild had tested this water gate when they were designing it. Even if they used ballistae to bombard it continuously, it would last at least a tenth of an hourglass. This period of time was enough for the garrison troops to completely destroy the water gate and block this path. With just 2 people and 2 horses, wanting to break through this water gate was no different from a fool's dream. Needless to say, number 27 was still chasing after them with his flintlock cannon. The guards of the Messias family on the Watergate covered bridge had also taken out their bows and arrows to stop them. "Young master, you go first." Old Weather, who was floating on the water, suddenly spoke to Harriman, who was swimming in front of him. Then, he suddenly pressed down on the neck of the horse he was hugging tightly. After the 2 of them leaped into the canal with their horses, they used one hand to grab onto the horse's neck and the other to push forward. At this moment, with Old Weather's forceful push, the horse neighed in fright. Then, its nose and mouth were submerged in the cold river water, and a large gush of bubbles gushed out. Using this force, Old Weather jumped out of the water with a whoosh. Then, he stomped on the horse's head that had just emerged from the water. This old man, who was close to 70 years old, actually leaped over a dozen yards in the air and landed on the bridge above the water gate like a cannonball. After landing on the ground, his stooped body rolled forward like a rubber ball, avoiding the swords and sabers of the Messias family guards that were slashing at him. When he stood up again, his 2 hands, which were always holding each other, pulled out 2 sharp spikes that were about the length of his forearm from both sides of his sleeve. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. With a few sudden thrusts, his shoulders moved his arms, and the spikes pierced into the chainmail of several guards. Every time he pulled out the spikes, blood would spurt out from the guards' wounds, but this blood did not stain Old Weather's wet robes, not even a drop. This was the first time Harriman had seen this old servant's ability, and he could not help but be stunned. However, Radish pulled him back to reality with all his might as he tried his best to swim forward. The corpse of an old horse was floating on the water behind him. It was motionless, and blood was flowing out from its nose and mouth. Just now, Old Weasel had borrowed strength from its body and directly killed this mount. The cold river water caused Harriman to tremble. Not far away, the water gate was already halfway down and would soon reach the surface of the river. He increased the speed of his paddling. Keys squatted at the top of the steeple and looked through the layers of bricks at Arthas, who had returned to the demon's summoning room, and then glanced at Old Weather, who was showing off his skills near the water gate. Finally, he looked at the 2 figures on the outer wall of the steeple. The former number 2 bandit in Soft Maple City, the only one left after being chased by the juniper tree on the day of his escape. He remembered Old Weather's identity. However, this was not something worth paying attention to. Being a servant in the Green family in Emerald Wood City was definitely a better job compared to being a bandit. It did not harm one's health and effectively prolonged the bandit's life. "You're quite energetic." From the corner of his eye, he saw Old Weasel pushing a water gate guard to the side of the winch and nailing the unlucky bastard to death in the winch's wheel with spikes. Quest commented objectively. Then, he turned his attention to Android 34 and the demonized monster. With Old Weather's help, it should not be a problem for Harriman to rush out of Valensburg. As for whether Android 27 would chase after them, Keys felt that she would not have such thoughts in a while. Her partner, Android 34, would not be able to hold on for long. Even though everything was still a mystery right now. Controlling the 6 metal flying claws, Android 34's condition was much better than the monster created by Arthas. He was not crushed by the steeple that had turned into a millstone-like steeple, and he was not injured for the time being. Moreover, when the monster was accidentally injured and fell, Android seized the opportunity to pull out 2 battle axes and jump down from a high place, slashing at the monster's hanging body. Slash! Android 34 dodged the remaining half of the monster's antlers, and the 2 battle axes slashed at the monster's shoulder blades, tearing off a large piece of the monster's flesh with the momentum of falling. His feet stepped on the monster's back, and the 2 battle axes were like mountaineering axes, slashing rhythmically at the monster's back. Not only that, but the 6 flying claws were also scratching and stabbing at the monster. He was continuously bleeding the monster. Compared to most of the beasts and monsters in the material plane, this half-demonic monster had more vitality, but it was still a body of flesh and blood. It would have wounds, bleed, and gradually become tired due to injury or battle. Whether it was grabbing number 34 with its arms or throwing its back against the outer wall of the spire, so that it could smash number 34 who was standing on its back into a meat patty, in the end it could not effectively get rid of number 34's constant harassment and sneak attacks. Chapter 1108. The monster was finally enraged by the continuous slashing. It roared and slashed at number 37's arm, leaving a bone-deep gash. However, the monster was unable to react in time and could not stop its momentum. Both of its legs were suspended in the air, and only one of its hands was hanging on the outer wall of the spire. Good chance. Number 37's eyes narrowed. Ignoring his injury, he took the opportunity to hurl the battle axe in his hand. The battle axe made of fine steel spun and flew out. With a bam! It slammed into the monster's finger that was holding on to the wall. The monster's finger trembled involuntarily. Then, like a human howling in despair, it fell to the ground more than 150 feet away. The guards of the Messias family who were looking up saw this scene and scattered, leaving enough space for the monster to make a hard landing. The Green Deacon of the city's druid conclave hurriedly chanted an incantation and stomped his feet. In an instant, 3 stone spikes that were as thick as a bowl and as long as a person grew out of the bluestone floor. The monster was skewered on the spikes. Not only was its head broken and bleeding, its bones and tendons were broken, but there were also 3 stone spikes that pierced through its chest. The spikes tore at its huge mouth with fangs and a long tongue that grew out of its chest. Scarlet, foamy blood gushed out from the wound. Messias stared at the monster that was slowly dying. Under the light of the torches, his face was terrifyingly gloomy. "Why did I encounter a bunch of useless trash?" The county governor cursed in his heart. The demon sent by His Majesty Graz, ZT, just promised that this monster could kill 2 Alavras. In the end it fell like a dead dog, but the androids are still alive. Also, Messias glared at the Green Deacon. Didn't you also promise that you could kill both the monster and the 2 Alavras? Why did you kill the monster and leave the androids alone? You want me to recommend you to be an elder of the conclave? You must be dreaming. Just as this lord was fuming with anger, the green-robed deacon finally made a new move. Number 34 had also landed on the ground. He calmly looked at the more than a dozen family guards who were holding swords and shields in front of him. On the other side, there were even more guards holding halberds. They were swinging their halberds at the monster, trying to whittle away its last trace of vitality. "Put down your weapon." The Green Deacon pointed at number 34 with his halberd. His other hand was behind his back. In an instant 12 circular pedestals suddenly rose from the bluestone floor. On each pedestal stood a humanoid figure holding a stone 2-handed sword. This was a simplified version of the golem. Although it couldn't be used as a bodyguard like the golem, The relatively low price of the pillar golems meant that they could be mass-produced and put into use. He pretended to be nice and said a series of words to Messias, such as, "I am a member of the Alavra legion sent by King Vexes. I personally have no intention of offending the authority of the sheriff, and King Vexes only sent us here to inform you that traces of the Soft Maple Expeditionary Army have appeared around Wallingsburg." At the same time, he secretly sent a message to his partner, number 27, for support through the short-distance communication device in his body. Just as Messias said, this was the mansion his family had lived in for generations. Even though King Vixeth had set up measures such as human pillars through the Druid faction in the city, that was only for defensive purposes. It was to deal with the possibility of a tragic street battle that might occur. His Majesty the King would not leave a symbol of ownership like the one on the walls of Wallingsburg in the house of a lord with real power. That was not only disrespectful to the Lord of the Fief, but also useless at the same time. After all, the ones guarding the mansion were Messias family guards. They weren't like the city's garrison. Legally speaking, the highest authority wasn't in the hands of the King of the Southern United Kingdom of Tapt. That was why he had ordered number 27 to dispatch the city guards and the Druid conclave to approach the mansion as he tried to appease the feudal official. Although Messias's rule in Valensburg had infiltrated every aspect of the city, and judging from the current situation, the city guards and the city druids were also at a disadvantage. However, number 34 didn't believe that there wasn't a single person loyal to the king in these two forces that Vexeth had personally established. However, Messias seemed to have seen through his trick. The sheriff did not seem to believe number 34's words at all, even if some of them were true and verifiable. "You are an assassin," Messias pointed at number 34's nose and cursed. "That monster might be an accomplice you brought into Wallingsburg on purpose." At this moment, the family guards had already used their halberds to completely kill the demonized deer with the bloodline of the Bugala apes. They split its head open with their axes. The head with half of its antlers was severed along the neck, rolling into a pool of dark red blood. "Kill him!" Messias ordered the family guards. "There's no need to capture him alive. His evil companion is waiting for him to accompany him." Having said that, the sheriff waved the 6-page Morning Star scepter in his hand, the hammer whistling as it cut through the air. He then took a crossbow from a guard beside him that had been rewound with a noose and pulley, and reloaded the explosive runes inscribed on the crossbow bolt into its quiver. Messias pulled the trigger, and the bolt flew towards number 34 with a whoosh. Although number 34 dodged the bolt that hit the limestone floor and exploded like a gunshot. All the family guards began to surround number 34. The shield-bearers opened up a path in front with their shields, while the halberd-wielding guards walked behind them, ready to give the enemy a head-on blow if the shield wall broke. Some even circled to number 34's side with bows and arrows, shooting at him from afar. The 12 statues controlled by the green-robed deacon slid along the base with a whoosh, raising their greatswords and charging forward. "Damn it!" While dodging, Nr. 34 coldly glanced at Magistrate Matius. He was now less than 20 steps away from the feudal lord. If he were to go all out, it would not be impossible for him to charge over and kill him on the spot. However, even though he knew that capture the ringleader was the best way to deal with the bandits, he could not do so. Although he and his partner had decided to revamp Valensburg, and even secretly get rid of Messias in the end, they had yet to go through the various procedures of a public trial and sentencing. Killing a powerful noble like Messias in public would have too great of an impact, and they did not dare to act rashly. This was especially so now, when the allied country was facing an expedition army that was eyeing them covetously. Internal unrest would weaken the country's will to resist. Chapter 1109. Indecisive. Keys, who was sitting at the top of the steeple, looked at the battle below with interest and gave a pertinent comment. "This matter has nothing to do with me," Keys thought. Then he looked at Magistrate Matius, who was shouting loudly with the family guards and commanding them to attack number 34. Keys smiled and said, "It's your bad luck to be caught red-handed by me." Keys would not be stingy with guessing the thoughts of the demon cult that was looking for a place to flourish in his own land, even if it was a wasteland in the corner. At the same time, he would definitely use the cruelest means to declare his sovereignty to the guests from the abyss. As for the guy who was fighting with the demons, don't you worship demons? I'll let you see enough today. Didn't you summon the bastard son of Six Fingers? I'll let him be your guide today. You go first, and he will follow after you to keep you company. Keys hooked his finger, and the son of the demon lord, Asath, who was circling around the summoning of the demons in the steeple and dealing with all kinds of invisible enemies, instantly sensed it. He stepped out of the window, jumped from 100 feet in the air, and jumped to the middle of the steeple square. He held the fine gold rapier in his palm with 6 fingers, and with the momentum of his fall, he easily tore a hole in the rope net covering the square for him to pass through. The half-demon dark elf's movements were so fast that it was dazzling. Except for number 34, no one could detect his figure. After this guy landed, he directly pounced on the corpse of the headless monster. Flesh fusion. Because he was half-drow, when he fought with other demons in the abyss, Ashaz would be very careful to avoid competing with them in terms of physical strength. Most of the time, he would use magic or extraordinary agility to deal with the enemy. Moreover, in order to make up for this shortcoming, he also developed this flesh fusion spell. As a last resort, he would temporarily fuse with the demon corpse on the battlefield, using the opponent's strong physique and his own strange and changeable spells to continue the battle. However, he was the son of the demon lord after all. In Asatha's eyes, most of the demons he had possessed before were high-level demons. Most of them were 6-armed snake demons. By chance, he even successfully possessed the body of a Baler that had not been activated by the incineration explosion spell. It was the first time in more than 1,000 years that Asath had wronged himself and fused with a monster with the bloodline of the Bugala demon ape. He was also helpless. The son of the demon lord had completely lost himself in the illusion created by Keys. Not only did he treat the monster's body as a life-saving straw, but he also did not notice that Keys used an electromagnetic nail gun with a large number of runes engraved on the body. With his gun, once he fused with the body, he would become one with the body. Not only was that body not his armor, but it was also a cage prepared for him. Originally, even if this guy died in the material plane, Asath was luckier than most demons because of the noble demonic bloodline in his body. He could be reborn in a corner of the 3-level abyss ruled by his father, Graz Zeti. However, when he fused with the monster's corpse, the demon lord's bloodline was divided, the part that originated from the drow, and then divided again. Arthas could no longer return to the abyss like a real creature from another plane. He was exiled to the body and was tortured all the time. When the headless corpse with its body full of cuts and chisels got up again, it immediately picked up the head that rolled on the ground and placed it on its neck without hesitation. The head that was missing most of the antlers had healed, but the wounds on its neck and body began to flow out black, asphalt-like liquid. Just as Asath stood up again, the layer of blood where he stood was stained with a large black mark. In the middle of the sky, dark clouds began to gather, and the stars and moon that illuminated the night sky were covered by the dark clouds. Although the lights in Valensburg, especially in the mansion of the Messias family, were bright, the people in this place still felt oppressed by the darkness. Even Arthas himself couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. Finally, the unlucky son of the demon lord looked at Messias. "Because you summoned the monarch of darkness, and then I was sent to this material plane, so can it be understood that if you die, I can no longer obey the orders of His Majesty and return to the abyss immediately? Asatha's mentality was a little broken. He had decided to use reasonable betrayal to solve the current problem. Presumably, the six-fingered monarch would not blame him for the death of a worshipper. After all, his value was much higher than that of an ordinary human noble. So, a vast expanse of darkness shrouded the entire mansion of the Messias family. Although the spellcasters hired by the county magistrate saw that the situation was not right and quickly cast a counterspell, they were still unable to quickly dispel the darkness spell that covered such a wide area. In the unnatural darkness created by the spell, not even the light of a torch could penetrate. The only thing that could be seen was the cries of the crowd, the miserable howls of some people before they died, and the roars and roars of monsters as they massacred. Dozens of miles away from Valensburg, Harriman rode slowly on Radish's saddle. He was dizzy and delirious. The warhorse beneath him was also moving slowly and unsteadily. It was able to persist for so long with two people on its back. By the standards of a warhorse, it was definitely stubborn and sturdy. Harriman's head drooped weakly in front of his chest. His clothes were all wet and shivering in the wind. His eyelids could not be opened as if they were filled with lead. His entire body felt like it was being pricked by needles, and his hands could not even hold the reins tightly. Hypothermia. As a highly educated, Halid scholar, Harriman had some understanding of this term. He could roughly guess the cause of his current condition. Most of his equipment was thrown into the river when he swam. He had neither dry clothes to change into nor food to replenish his calories. Although he had kept a tube of self-made potion that could save his life in his sleeve, in order to save the wounded old weather, he had just poured the potion that could quickly heal his wounds and replenish his stamina into the old man's mouth. In order to wait for the potion bottle that he had designed to automatically replenish itself after adding in some ingredients, he had to hold on for about 3 hourglasses. The premise was that he could not be caught by the soldiers behind him. Chapter 11:10. In the end, in order to conserve horsepower, Harriman could only dismount and lead Radish along the river. When he reached the foot of the mountain, Harriman heard the sound of a horn from behind him. It was the warning signal of Varensburg. Harriman thought that it was the garrison troops on the move, so he immediately started running. After running for about half a mile, they entered an ancient dark forest filled with oak trees covered in moss. He had to bend his body to pass through the thick branches and jump over the thick and tangled root. These roots tripped him several times. However, the pursuers did not appear. Harriman. A figure suddenly appeared by his side, causing Harriman to quiver in fright. However, when he saw who it was, he was finally able to put his heart at ease. Hugh Hood. You look like you need a bonfire and a decent dinner. Keyes, who was disguised as a young gunslinger, tightened his grip on the spear on his back and helped Harriman take Radish's reins. Then, he led him to Grinder's hiding place. Grilled trout, roasted hare, 2 salted pancakes, and a small jug of honey wine helped Harriman recover from his cold state. Sitting by the bonfire, he silently dried his clothes. Old Weather also woke up, ate something, and then lay down on a warm pit and fell asleep again. This warm pit was made by digging out a flue from the ground and padding it with firewood. A person could lie on top of it to maintain their body temperature. Even without a blanket, it was still warm. No one is chasing us, and I have already set up a warning trap. You can rest for the night. Tomorrow morning, we will depart for Cachalin. Not long after Harriman and the others had eaten, Keyes, who did not eat dinner with them, came back with a sour apple in his hand. Grinder will be on duty tonight. He did not drink too much during the day, and he can sleep on the carriage tomorrow. Seeing that everything had been arranged, Harriman was no longer nervous. He laid down on a warm pit and quickly fell asleep. Even though he did not know why the cyborg did not chase after them, he believed in the abilities of his companions. Hugh Hood's ability to survive in the wild was needless to say. That guy seemed to have never suffered any hardships before. Just like this warm pit, he always had a way to make himself safe and comfortable in the wild. As for the dwarf on night duty, Grinder was a dwarf with the profession of subterranean digger. The dark environment and the earth were his natural allies. Even if he drank too much during the day and slept soundly, it was unlikely that he would be ambushed. The night passed in silence. Early the next morning, they started their journey back to Catelyn. Old Weather's wounds healed quickly, but Harriman still let him ride Radish, who had eaten a full meal of oatcakes. He himself led the horse and tried his best to keep up with Hugh Hood and Grinder, who were riding off-road bicycles. The situation improved as they passed through a village. They spent some silver coins to buy an old horse. Old Weather switched to a new one, and Harriman was once again able to sit on Radish's broad back, urging the horse forward. They passed through the forest and tangled thorns, and then over a mountain surrounded by fog. The whole mountain was like a small island in the gray sea. After about 3 days of trekking, the four of them finally saw the birch forest outside of Catelyn. They also saw the soft maple expeditionary force that had already entered the town. Under the persuasion of Toulouse, the villagers did not quarrel with the soldiers who came across the sea. In return, the soft maple commander, led by Grisus, restrained his men and did not let them rob the villagers of their belongings or harass the women in the town. In order to find something for the motivated soldiers to do, the commander of the soft maple expeditionary force ordered the soldiers to work overtime to build a road from Fort Hague, which was the military fortress where many nobles were stationed, to Catelyn. This road was built according to the specifications of the Ramsay continent. Not only was it wide enough for 2 carts to travel side by side, but it was also very straight and flat. In addition, Harriman also saw something different in the soft maple camp. The expeditionary force transported a dozen long and narrow arrow-shaped warships to the shore. With the cooperation of the blacksmiths, armorers, and spellcasters, they transformed these warships into a kind of skimmer that had only recently appeared on the Ramsay continent. This kind of vehicle could float in the air. Although it could not rise to a high altitude, at most 30 feet above the ground, it could still allow it to freely pass through the land, swamps, and forests that were not too tall or too dense. The skimmer could also carry small cannons and archers, which were powerful reinforcements on the battlefield. They don't seem to be attacking the town. Other than some cannons that can be used in the wild, I don't see the army preparing any other siege weapons. For Harriman, there were almost no restricted areas in the soft maple expeditionary forces camp, so after looking around, he had a general understanding of the army's pre-war preparations. When they returned to the tent allocated by Grisus for him, Old Weather, and 2 other adventurer companions, Harriman told them what he saw and thought. Keyes held a tin cup with some mint in it as a drink. They had just eaten a very tasty dinner. Mutton pies, marinated and fermented cod, mixed blood intestines, and moldy cheese with lettuce cream soup. They needed something to rinse their mouth. The dwarf Grinder chose Hoffman beer without hesitation, while Keyes made himself a cup of mint tea and got some hazelnuts and pine nuts as snack. "We can't agree to any more," Quest said to Halamund as he sipped on his hot tea. "The soft maple expeditionary army is most likely going to land here as a feint. Then, they'll immediately head north to meet with the Yomian's army. After combining their forces, they'll rush towards the capital of the southern country." "Looks like these human bastards don't need you to find any modified humans," Grindel interjected, burping as he spoke. Harriman shrugged helplessly. "I don't think Grisus will give up any forces at his disposal now. Although I've already facilitated the cooperation between him and Catelyn, allowing the soft maple people to obtain a foothold on Taput Island without shedding a single drop of blood, the previous mission has yet to be completed. I don't think he'll let me go so easily. I can't leave this camp easily." Keyes laughed. But you've also brought the information, and the Oliveira Legion is in Valensburg. You didn't manage to get rid of those modified humans hiding in the shadows, but they probably won't be able to stop the soft maple people with assassination method. Seeing that Harriman was a little puzzled, Quest continued. Oliveira is not just an assassination team. Didn't you also say that the modified humans who entered Valensburg were very ostentatious? They even took over the city's defense at once? After listening to Quest's words, Harriman fell into deep thought. Indeed, he didn't think too much about this discovery of his. Next, the few of them chatted for a few hourglasses before burrowing into their sealskin sleeping bags one after another. Just like that, they rested in the camp for 2 days. After the soft maple expeditionary army crossed the sea, they rested for nearly 2 weeks before setting off again. Under Grice's instructions, Harriman and a few others followed a vanguard of 1,000 men and marched northwest. There were 3 other similar vanguard groups. The purpose of these 4 vanguard groups was to wipe out the various small towns and villages along the path of the main army. However, most of these small towns and villages did not have much strength to resist and would most likely surrender at the mere sight of them. Their mission was most likely to be to find a suitable path for marching and a water supply point to save time for the main army. The soft maple expeditionary army had rested for enough time and would most likely not reorganize before they met up with the Yomians. Most of Harriman's 1,000-man group were foot soldiers. A small portion of them were pack beasts that were used to pull carriages and transport military supplies. Every 1,000-man group was equipped with 2 skimming boats, with 2 spellcasters on each boat. With enough obsidian orbs, the 2 spellcasters would take turns steering the magical boat. With enough obsidian orbs, they could travel at a speed of 6 parsecs, about 60 kilometers per hour, all day long. Because Harriman was of noble birth, even though he had repeatedly stated that this trip to Tapped Island was a solo adventure and did not represent the Grimm family, they were all arranged to be on a skimming boat. Even the warhorse, Radish, was given such preferential treatment. It was not like the old horse Weather had bought on his way back to the camp and was forced to be used as a draft animal for transporting goods. The 1,000-man group traveled for an entire day. Although the general direction was towards Valensburg, they did not try to travel in a straight line like Harriman and the other 3. Instead, they tried their best to find forest paths and mountain ridges to advance. Unless absolutely necessary, they would not enter dense forests or swamp. 2 skimming boats would take turns to leave the main group and explore the path ahead. Both skimming boats carried cartographers. Every time the skimming boats stopped, they would disembark to construct landmarks and other markers. When they returned to the skimming boats, they would use compasses, rulers, maps, and other tools to draw military maps with information on landmarks, descriptions of the terrain, and descriptions of the ecological environment on large parchments that had been treated with acidification. Before setting up camp, it was the turn of the skimming boat of Harriman's group to explore the path. Under the control of the spellcasters, the arrow-shaped boat climbed to a high ground. Standing at the bow of the skimming boat, Harriman could see with his naked eye that there was a muddy path at the foot of a hill not far away. It meandered from the forest to the south and passed through the farmlands. It was probably a woodcutter's path that led from the forest to the farmlands in the west. At the end of the farmlands was most likely a village. At the junction of the 2 roads, there was a black object that looked sharp and angular. Harriman guessed that it was a scarecrow or something. Generally speaking, the intersection was a place where strange things often happened. Thus, the superstitious villagers of Talbot Island had a habit of placing a scarecrow at the intersection, or hanging the coat of arms of the local nobles to drive away any lingering ghosts. But when he followed the cartographers from the skimming boats, who were to be protected by a group of soldiers and archers, he realized that it was not a scarecrow when he got closer. It was the corpse of a man hanging shakily from a crude gallows. He walked to the intersection. The wind gradually died down, and a cloud of dust floated in front of him like a brown cloud. Harriman stopped and stared at the man hanging from the pole in front of him. As soon as the dust settled, it was blown up into a swirl by the wind. The man's bare, black and swollen feet dangled at the shoulder height of a grown man. The corpse's head hung to one side like a puppy being held by the neck. His face had not been pecked beyond recognition by birds, which meant that he had been hanging there for no more than a day or two. Half of a tattered wooden board hung from his chest, with the words, "In the King's Domain," scrawled on it. The other half fell to the road and read, "Worship the Devil." These words were written in the common tongue of the southern kingdom of Talbot, and Harriman could not understand them. He regretted that he did not save enough pocket money when he was studying in King's Landing to have the spellcasters cast permanent spells such as glib tongue or language proficiency for him. Although permanent spell services could also be purchased from the scale of perpetual order, the price was too high. Even though Harriman was the young master of the Green family, it was difficult for him to fork out the cost in one go. Usually, if there was a need, such as when he was reading in the library, Harriman would buy some alchemy potions with similar effects but with a longer duration. The price of those alchemy potions was only a fraction of the price of permanent spell services. At this moment, the young gunner, Hugh Hood Keyes, stepped forward and waved away a swarm of flies around the court. He picked up the broken wooden board on the ground and turned it over to look at the small line of words written in chalk on the back of the board. The 13th day of the 9th month, 32nd year of the Vixia's calendar. Keyes thought for a moment and calculated in his mind. It should be the day before yesterday, when we just returned to Cachalin. And he paused and pointed at the small line of words and read, "After the joint examination of the acting military officer of Valensburg, number 34 and number 27 of King Vixia's Oliveira Legion, the verdict is confirmed." At this time, Harriman also reacted and couldn't help but be shocked. What happened in Valensburg? What's wrong with Magistrate Macius? It's one thing for King Vixitha's envoy to take over military affairs, but why is he issuing the order to kill demon worshippers? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.